All right, it is 1 o'clock, so that means it's time for us to begin. We always have a strict focus on beginning and ending on time, and so we'll try to maintain that record. Welcome to the FCC Technological Advisory Council. We do have one new member to officially welcome, and Hans Schmidtka is here from Juniper Networks. So Hans, raise your hand, wave. It's good to have you with us. Welcome to this group. It's a very staid group, as you've probably already found. Very very quiet, very retiring sort of group. Not, as my kids would say, but we're delighted to have you with us. I don't think there are any other new members at this time. If there are, and I've not recognized you, then it's Walt's fault. Always assign blame appropriately and quickly. We do have a busy agenda, having pre-reviewed, as hopefully you all have, the materials that have been passed around. There's a great deal of progress that we have to review today, and hopefully, as we are always focused, our goal is to have actionable recommendations out of this group that we can present to Tom, our overall chairman. He's anxiously awaiting those inputs, as you might expect. And even though he wasn't able to join us today, he is very much with us. And in fact, to demonstrate the fact that he's very much with us, he's actually provided us with 2 new assignments to indicate his great support and enthusiasm for what we do. And
where do you want to go?
Where do I want to go? I want to go to...
Right there.
Yes.
Okay, right there.
To the new working groups. Thank you. Okay. Walt expects me to not only talk, but to advance the slides as well. This is a great and taxing challenge. The 2 new working groups that he has asked us to undertake. We'll have actually a presentation on the first one, in part because I know very little about it. But this is the electronic reporting of broadband availability. This is something that has been undertaken in semi-paper form in the past, but we're moving at blinding speed.
It's actually been electronic. This is an improvement.
Yes. That's why I said semi. Walt's coaching me here. It's not paper. It was actually done electronically, but we've moved to a higher state of capability, moving things to a faster pace at acquiring the information and in making it available, and that's a goal in many of the things that we do. But the focus is on our understanding of our broadband availability. And the specific form involved is Form 477 for those of you who are aficionados of the forms. And I see Nomi nodding her head, so this is something that you're very familiar with.
You can also shout bingo if you have it.
Yeah. So to share with us a little bit more about the effort that we are to undertake in this area is Chelsea Fallon. She is Assistant Chief in the Wireline Bureau in the IATD organization, which some of you, I am told, are very familiar with, but which I am only learning about, and that's the Industry Analysis and Technology Division. So, Chelsea, with that, if you would take the floor and lead us through that which we are about to undertake as an organization.
So many of the TAC members are also companies that file FCC Form 477, which is currently the main vehicle that the Commission uses to collect data on subscribership to broadband and voice services. And in a 2013 order, the Commission adopted changes to the Form 477. And the most notable change is that the FCC will be assuming responsibility for the collection of data on broadband deployment or availability. This is an effort that is currently overseen by NTIA and the state entities to support the National Broadband Map. And in order to accommodate the changes that were adopted in this order, the Commission has developed a brand new filing interface, web-based interface, which it plans to launch this summer for the collection of data as of June 30th, 2014. And in advance of the full launch of this new filing interface, we are looking to create a working group that would have a handful of filers test and provide feedback on the interface. And the order actually directed the wireline and the wireless bureaus to explore technical improvements to the form's filing mechanism, and that included testing with different filers. And we think that getting feedback in advance of the launch will ultimately result in a better, more stable product and interface. So for the working group, we are looking to have about 5 to 7 companies join the working group and participate in the testing. We think the TAC is the best vehicle for this because it will allow us to include companies that are different sizes and using different technologies, and that will allow all the different elements and parts of the form to be tested in advance. And it also allows us to keep the group to a manageable number. I think it would be infeasible to open the testing environment to all of the approximately 2,000 filers. And so this is an opportunity to test the interface and provide feedback. It is not an opportunity to submit your own data early. Once we've identified the specific member companies and the individuals within those companies who will be doing the testing, we will provide the testers with the information they need, including the web link to the environment, the testing only FRN and password for login, and the instructions for the filing. We plan to start this towards the end of this month, going through mid-July. And we would expect that the working group as a whole would probably develop formal feedback and recommendations. We would also anticipate that filers would provide us with informal feedback throughout the testing process on comment forms, because we do want to hear about defects that they encounter, kind of the day-to-day process of uploading and entering data. Now, the 2013 477 order also discussed the development of a client-side application, and that's something that would automate the process of geocoding and aggregating filers' address-level subscribership data at the required geography before submission to the Commission. We would also like the working group to provide input on the development of this application and be involved in the testing. However, that is not our near-term focus. We would not be starting that process until the fall of this year at the earliest. And the group of companies involved in the development of that application would not necessarily need to be the same group of companies involved in this sort of the near-term focus of testing the new web interface. So we appreciate support of this effort. We think it will lead to a better product, and anyone with, I guess, questions or interest can send me an email. My email address is Chelsea, CHELSEA.Fallon, FALLON, @FCC.gov. Thank you.
Very good. How many of you, like Nomi, know about Form 477? Raise your hand. Thank you for volunteering for the group.
All right.
We have it on. It's recorded.
Yeah, of course we have it recorded. So you have a good group of volunteers. And more seriously, this is an opportunity for you in one form, in that the form itself, 477, will be improved by virtue of your interaction around the form. The downside is that by virtue of being involved in the testing and contributing to it, you're no longer able to complain about the form when it doesn't meet all of your needs later. The more serious part, please, I think, why don't we just make this easy and pass around a paper so that people can sign up rather than even sending you the email, because we do have quite a number of people who are involved, and you can just indicate your interest, and then we'll deliver that to you at the end of the meeting.
Okay. That sounds great. Thank you.
Well, we'll do it.
Just do it with paper right now. Paper still works.
The problem is we don't have any paper.
I'll give you a piece of paper.
Now we
I
know
also
what.
have paper.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you.
The second item that some of you are already aware of is an interesting opportunity for us to become involved in law enforcement. And this is the epidemic, actually, that is occurring in the smartphone and even more generally smart device theft arena. As of the last input from the local Washington, D.C. authorities, the commissioner, 46% of the thefts in Washington, D.C. are of smart devices. And it is clearly something that does need to be addressed, and it's a challenge. We could go into lots of details on the elements of the challenge, but it is a very challenging environment, and so the chairman has asked if we would look into this from a technological perspective and try to come up with what we believe to be the most appropriate solutions to the problem. Now, the difficulty with that statement is that, as I've now probed on this for the last couple of months, no one exactly knows what the problem is, beyond the fact that there are lots of phones being stolen, and that's not a very good thing. But where those phones go, how they're redistributed, how they're monetized, what the real nature of the problem is as it becomes a part of the criminal system is something that needs to be much more carefully examined. There are a lot of solutions that have been thrown around, and depending on what the problem is, those solutions may have great relevance or may have no relevance at all. So the intent is that we will have a workshop that will try to examine the problem from three dimensions, problem and solution from three dimensions. First is to listen to some of our folks in the police and more generally public safety side of the issue, because this often becomes an issue of personal safety. It's not just that the phone is snatched, but the person is whacked before the phone is snatched. So it's a difficult problem. So we'll hear about that first. Then we'll talk about what is known, at least in a public sense, about the system that underlies the theft of the device and where these devices go. And then third, we'll talk about what the current state of the art is on the solution set, the solution sets that's been advanced. And there is a lot of activity in this space. There is a law that has been passed in Minnesota in this area requiring that something be done by next July. It is not entirely clear what is to be done, but something will be done by the 1st of July. And there are other states that are in the process of establishing legislation as well. So this is a very urgent and timely matter that I think we can provide some assistance with, and we'll begin that process on the 19th with a workshop. In the best of traditions, that'll lead to a working group to study it and then see if we can't come up with some helpful solutions over the course of the next 6 months. Now, adding these two activities is unusual for the TAC, so we're really trotting new ground, Traditionally, we've established working groups at the beginning of the year, or preferably at the end of the prior year, run them through the year, come out with conclusions at the end of the year, and then restart the process. So we are advancing in our activity level by adding this new formulation of interim activities. And the fortuitous part is that we have grown as a body, not just the TAC around the table, but the subject matter experts that have joined some of our working groups, and that gives us a capacity that exceeds what we've previously had, that gives us some ability to deal with some of these issues. So any questions around the smart device theft item? How many of you are planning to come? Yeah. After my last one, no one will raise their hand ever again. How many of you are planning to come on the 19th? Brian's the only one? No, okay. There are a few people. Good. Because I'm hoping perhaps a few more, and those of you who have not been aware of this previously, I apologize that we didn't get that word more broadly out. But hopefully we'll have a good representation from the TAC itself. I know that this is a more distant issue for some of you than for others. But it is an opportunity for us to serve and to contribute to the greater good, and that's what we're here for. So that's a good thing for us. All right, with that, we can probably go.
Internet of Things.
No, we can go back to the list.
Okay.
There we go. There, working groups. And what I'd like to do now, since we've launched in, but traditionally we always make one round around the table to have everyone introduce themselves, because some people never can keep a job like David Tennant, so you always have to have people introduce themselves and the company that they're with, just to keep track of the players and their relationships. I shouldn't be picking on David, but you're such an easy target. So if we could go around the table, introduce yourself, introduce your current role, and if you want to highlight your role versus what your role was last time we met, that's fine too. But go ahead and start.
Walter Johnson with the FCC and Office of Engineering and Technology, and the designated federal officer for the TAC.
Teresa Hennessy, Comcast.
Kevin Kahn, representing Intel.
Jeff Mendenhall, representing Gates Air, successor to Harris Broadcast, and I'm a technology advisor to them.
Mark Bregman, CTO of Newstar.
Fred Kemmer, GenBand Technology Advisor to CEO.
Marty Cooper, Data LLC.
Shahid Ahmed, Accenture.
Jack Michalski from Qualcomm.
Steve Lanning, Viasat.
Jesse Russell, Inc. Networks, Small Cell Technology, CEO.
Lynn Claudy, National Association of Broadcasters.
David Tannenhouse, I'm now Chief Research Officer at VMware.
Russell Jurek, Cisco.
Nomi Bergman with Bright House.
Milo Medine, I'm Vice President of Access Services at Google.
Brian Daly, AT&T.
Doug Jones, Verizon.
Mark Gornberg, Zeta Venture Partners.
Pierre Lefray, Silicon Flatiron Center at UC Boulder.
Marvin Servio, Carnegie Mellon University.
John Dobbins, EVP Network Operations at Earthlink.
Mark Bayless with Visual Inc.
Lynn Merrill, representing NTCA.
Jack Waters, Level 3.
Hans-Jürgen Schmidtke, now the new guy here at the table, and representing Juniper Networks.
Mike McNamara, Vice President of Network Services for TW Telecom.
Brian Markwalter, Consumer Electronics Association.
Greg Lappin, representing ARRL.
George Popovich, Office of the CTO, Motorola Solutions, sitting in for Paul Steinberg.
Kevin Sparks, Alcatel-Lucent in the corporate CTO office.
Adam Drobot, Open Tech Works.
Dick Green, Liberty Global.
Henning Schultz-Winnie, Office of Strategic Planning, FCC.
Julie Knapp, Office of Engineering and Technology, FCC.
And I am Dennis Roberson, which you all hopefully knew by now, and from Illinois Institute of Technology. So we'll jump right into the presentations. The ordering today, we'll hear from the Internet of Things, from Ruscat and David Tennanthouse, and then move on to Spectrum and Receiver Performance with Lynn Cloudy, Advanced Sharing and Enabling Wireless Technologies, and Brian and Milo will be speaking today, Brian Daly and Milo Medine. Cybersecurity, I am smiling because we, in the absence of Paul Steinberg, we have 3 people presenting for that group. George Popovich will be presenting along with Alan Drabat and Mike McNamara. And then we'll, as our grand finale, we'll have the supporting the transition to IP with Nomi Bergman from Bright House Networks. So that's our direction, and I'll leave it to Thing 1 and Thing 2 to begin your presentation.
Thank you, Dennis. We go to the next slide, please. Oh, thanks. I have the clicker. Okay, first I want to thank, Dave and I both want to thank the IoT Working Group. We've had, I think, a very active past 3 months since the kickoff. We'll go through some of that work that we did as a team, as well as our preliminary recommendations and next steps. Also want to thank Walter Johnston for all his work in keeping us on track and focused on things that are relevant and imperative to the FCC. So this is our charter slide. I spent about enough time on that, I think. We have a lot more content I'd rather cover, so we're just going to skip over that for now. Some of the actions we took over the last 3 months, we did a detailed taxonomy. I know this sounds like it's boring, but it was actually a fairly exhaustive and, not in a negative way, a fairly exciting study because it brought out several key points to us in terms of both spectrum, security, and other requirements that are helping guide us over the recommendations and the next steps. We also mapped some of the standards work and activities. We tried to limit it to the top 10 standards organizations. I think we ended up with about 13 or 14 on the chart. There's dozens more, but we wanted to try to hit the really top impactful ones that were relevant in terms of the work we're doing with the FCC. And we've also generated our initial findings in a strawman proposal, which we'll go over on the recommendations, and identified our next steps, which are still fluid because we're looking for feedback from all of you in the room on those next steps as well. So this is a real small view of the spreadsheet. I think we ended up with about 30 columns when we built out the taxonomy from the different verticals. And David's going to talk about the 3 specific areas that we broke out that were very critical in terms of how devices connect and which part of the spectrum they connect to. The second set, and I think everybody on the tax should have received these documents with the original PowerPoint that was sent out. This is the IoT standards mapping. Again, we had about 14 different groups that we covered, what their focus was, whether it was security, privacy, what impact it would be to either spectrum, the network, et cetera. And that will help guide us, I think, as we dive deeper into the spectrum issues as well as the security issues, which we'll talk about in next steps. The item we're still working on and have to do over the summer is the spectrum mapping. We're hoping to get some help from the spectrum sharing group. And this is an exercise that, Walter gave us some guidance would be helpful as it helps put in place at least what is available today. Hopefully we can get a viewpoint on what's being used today, where there could be a challenge, and then we can focus our efforts around recommendations to how to either mitigate that or work around what's available, because spectrum is a scarce resource and not unlimited. So there's a lot of work to be done yet here on the spectrum roadmap. Connectivity framework, I'm going to turn it over to you, David.
Thanks, Russ. Okay, so after we had that sort of great big matrix that Russ referred to in the Excel spreadsheet that had lots of columns with lots of different use cases, we looked through that and saw that there was sort of a small number of common rows. In other words, a lot of those use cases had similar attributes, even if they were pretty widely divergent in terms of the application domain, et cetera. Those had implications both in terms of the communication links and in terms of the security aspects going forward. So if we look at the communication links, we sort of stopped and said, okay, let's, instead now of thinking about all the different kinds of things, let's think about the different types of communication links that the things use to communicate. And that got us down to these three dominant classes of wireless IoT links. Now, I emphasize wireless. There are obviously going to also be wired things. In many cases, there are many of those out there today. There'll continue to be some. But, we expect the explosive growth to be on the wireless side, and, of course, that's also the side that could pose the most challenges potentially to the FCC. So we boiled that down into these three cases. One is where things directly communicate with each other. Examples here would be sensors between cars communicating essentially with each other, car to car on a highway. So there's, in effect, no reach back to the broader internet or to the cloud or anything like that. It's really purely local communication. All of that is sort of within a sort of LAN-PAN range as far as we can tell, and could use spectrum that's suited to those sorts of distances. So it could sort of be treated similarly to other things that work at that range. The other type of link is when the thing communicates to other devices on the internet, but it goes through a hub or a proxy. So these are sometimes called hubs, gateways, lots of different terms. So we just settled on proxy for the moment. And in that case, again, you're primarily at LAN and PAN range, and it looks like you could, for those purposes, use spectrum that is suited to those distances. So again, share spectrum that's already being used for those sorts of services. The important things to notice in that case, one is IoT devices, the things won't be unique, but they will add a tremendous amount of new traffic to those services. Or to the spectrum that's typically used for those services. And that's both in terms of adding traffic to the short range, the LAN-PAN range, but also to the mechanism that that proxy uses to communicate back to the core internet. And, in some cases that might just be wired, but in many cases that might be wireless communication, say 4G, devices, something like that. There might be a 4G modem there that's taking traffic from the hub back to the core internet. So it's not that you need a new kind of communication link there. It's not that you necessarily need a new type of spectrum allocation, but we'll be putting tremendous amounts of new load onto that traffic. And then the third, and I guess I'd say that I think we predominantly have focused so far on this second category, the two subcases of it. The third case is where things may need to connect directly to an internet. So this is a case where, for example, a thing has a 4G modem directly built into it. And that would typically happen in cases where things are geographically spread out. In other words, it doesn't make sense to use a common hub because although you have a lot of the devices, they tend to be not near each other, and there's not an easy way to hub them. We need to dig deeper into that case to understand it better. So let's see if we page on. So one of the places that we realized as we sort of looked at things through this link-oriented framework as opposed to thing-oriented is that there is a particular challenge that's posed by long-lived devices. When we looked at all those columns, I talked about all the columns in the spreadsheet, it was sort of surprising how many of the columns were things that you might imagine having sort of on the order of 10-year lifetimes as opposed to, say, 3 to 5 year lifetimes. And some of them might be much more long-lived than that. So if you start building things into your buildings, if you start building things into the skin of aircraft, et cetera, those things could be around for a very long time. Now, that says there's a large number of different such use cases. That doesn't necessarily mean, that they're the predominant number of things. We don't know that yet, but there's definitely a lot of those use cases. So the dilemma that's posed then for, I guess, the FCC and the industry is, on the one hand, accommodating those long-lived devices, and on the other hand, we want to encourage rapid adoption of ongoing advances in spectral efficiency and also advances in security technology. So as those things get older, they're going to be sitting out there using essentially older spectral techniques and older security. So we came up with, as a strawman, this potential best practice that says to encourage long-lived things wherever possible to use this sort of short-range thing-to-proxy links. At least then you can get very high levels of spatial reuse. Then the proxy or gateway that they are working through could be upgraded periodically. So where you need to do the longer range, that's something that can then be periodically upgraded because there's, say, an order of magnitude or two orders of magnitude fewer of those. And a similar sort of reasoning could be applied to security. So that's sort of the framework we've been looking at this through. I advanced my slide, but not yours. And that leads to some initial findings, which I apologize for the small print, forced me to put my reading glasses on. I've sort of covered these, initial findings on spectrum to some degree already, just in setting up the framework. So I won't kind of try to read these out in great detail. But basically, it says that the FCC should be continuing to increase the availability of LAN PAN range spectrum, and the industry should be encouraged to adopt spectrally efficient technologies and or very high levels of spatial reuse. At least make sure you're always getting one of those, and preferably wherever possible both. But in the long-lived case, make sure you're getting at least the high-level spatial reuse. And that we believed, at least tentatively, that if you go down that path, that will accommodate the short-range thing-to-thing and thing-to-proxy links. And then the demand on upstream links will grow significantly. This is getting upstream from the proxies. But we think that there are some approaches that can be used to deal with that. So I'm going to try not to go through this in detail, read out every line here. That, if we want to accelerate IoT growth, the chair had charged this group to really look through, how can we accelerate IoT growth. One key thing will be making sure that, at least for the short-range spectrum, we stay well ahead of demand. So if I just go to the next chart, which is the strawman recommendations, because I think there's a little bit of kind of duplication of the concepts here, at least. The key word here on the first one is, the unique word, that there's really no unique allocations of spectrum to IoT are required. That's a sort of strawman conclusion. What we mean by that is essentially good news. Spectrum sharing, we think spectrum sharing will work in this case. In other words, IoT devices should, in the very short range, be able to share the spectrum with other short-range devices. And similarly, for those upstream channels from the proxies, you should be able to share with other things that require the upstream channels. That doesn't mean, oh, great, we've got enough spectrum in each case. It means we can share the spectrum with these other things, and that gets to sort of the second key finding, that the FCC should really put into place a system for periodically refreshing its analysis and plans to accommodate the spectrum demands in both of those sort of types of spectrum for very short range and spectrum for this upstreaming. So we want to be sort of very clear about that. It's not that there won't be high pressure or high demands on the spectrum. It's that it doesn't need to be unique to IoT. And it should be looked at in the picture of other things working in those spaces. The third strawman recommendation is essentially what I mentioned in terms of the approach that we had in the framework, that long-lived things should be encouraged to use short-range, unlicensed spectrum whenever a safe harbor from wireless technology evolution is required. So if somebody wants to put out something and know that they'll still be able to use that spectrum in 20 years, they should put it in the short-range unlicensed space. And not expect, for example, that if they use 2G spectrum and put out 2G devices, that they should expect there to be a network to carry their traffic for them 20 years from now. And finally, to stimulate IoT growth, the Commission should focus on the availability of unlicensed spectrum suitable to a range of these pan-LAN services. We think making sure that people that are likely to jump in and launch these devices know that there'll be plenty of spectrum and that the Commission is committed to sort of staying ahead of that demand on an ongoing basis will remove considerable uncertainty. I'm going to hand it back to Russ.
Yep. So I'm going to take over on security. One thing's very clear, the growth of IoT will increase the attack surface, meaning there'll be many, many more points that could potentially be used for denial of services or different security breaches. The group's initial findings here are that the solution remains an industry responsibility at this point in time, although critical devices that affect safety of life and property may have additional security requirements. That's another area we're going to look into deeper over the summer. For most IoT source data to be actionable, it will require identity and authentication to take place. That's sort of an industry best practice out there, which is a good thing. Scale of deployment may require that devices have a secure approach to planned end of life. This really addresses the point of devices being put out in the field and maybe expecting to live, or so-called live, for 3 or 4 years, still emitting 5-10 years later. Maybe there's some way to put an end of life in place so they're not just chirping like crickets and potentially eating up valuable spectrum or bandwidth. Also, one of the key points David talked about a little bit, these long-lived, low-cost devices, I think we need to recognize they are not going to be highly secure. They are not going to be programmable. They may be in life for 10 years, but they're probably, because they're low cost and long life, they will probably not be upgradable to the point that security will be upgraded. So the idea is, we'll get to the recommendation in a minute, but that is a challenge then. One approach might be to rely on upgradable secure proxies, which they connect to, of course, as well as, maybe even virtual type gateways that could be programmed, pushing that sort of security problem from the device or thing into the proxy itself. Okay, so our recommendations in this area specifically, it's felt that IoT suppliers should adopt security capabilities that are current, i.e. the security du jour should be implemented on those devices and at the time they're shipped, knowing that once you buy them and deploy them, they're not upgradable. Mechanisms should be provided to authenticate the provenance of IoT source data, at least to the level of the first proxy through which the data is passed. So therefore, putting that authentication process onto the proxy so that there is some security or level of security in terms of how you could mitigate a device or thing. Couple of recommendations for the FCC. They should focus their security efforts on limiting misuse of spectrum. This could become a problem if either faulty or poor workmanship of devices are built that continuously transmit. One of those could be the long life one. Another one could be that devices are broken and just transmit too much power or have other spectrum problems. Also, the FCC should use its bully pulpit a bit to seek and coordinate IoT security needs with other government stakeholders. This is not a U.S.-centric deployment. IoT is worldwide, and you're going to see devices coming in from worldwide. You're going to see networks that will have to coordinate whether it's a car you drive across a border or whether it's a device you travel with internationally. Some of the next steps we have as a team, we're going to further develop some use cases and run through a couple of our assumptions and hypotheses to further vet those. Size some of the IoT-related spectrum requirements. We had a meeting this morning where we're probably going to break that into two pieces, which is the very near field personal and LAN, or PAN and LAN aspects, and then the sort of the wireless 4G network that would be above that and try to divide it that way. Also, investigate approaches to stimulating IoT growth to ensure that available short-range spectrum will stay well ahead of what the demand is. Partner with the spectrum sharing group on this, we hope, and work with the FCC staff. And identify additional opportunities for the FCC to spur innovation and adoption. We definitely do not want things to slow down or to be any blocks to be put in place. So we focused on that over the summer as well. And engage in stakeholders. We're looking at a couple of use cases where we could even do a demonstration possibly and take a deep dive on what the actual impact would be, whether it's something like a driverless car or whether it's some type of wearable or some other type of usage that we could vet through some of the strawman recommendations. And I believe that's it. We'd like to get feedback and comments.
Remind you all, if you have questions, comments, use your tent card to indicate your interest, and right there we go.
Just a curiosity or follow up on the long kind of the future legacy problem you guys identified. Where you put something out there and it. I wonder if maybe the FCC may have to find something a little more active to do about that. What I'm worried about is sort of the inadvertent. Yeah, you gave me the advice, I didn't take it, and it's life critical. And we've seen kind of things like that in the past where there was a nominal allocation of spectrum or use or regulation, but, events sort of overcome it. And I could kind of see if there's not something there a little more actively at the front end that says this is not just a good idea. You really need to have a way to be able to move technologies that you'll get some people, not necessarily even in the private sector, who deploy solutions dependent upon, the existing cellular network in some way. And even though we've all said, yeah, it's going to change, it's not set up to change. And what happens is, 10 years from now, Verizon or AT&T or whoever the companies are sitting there being beat to hell by somebody saying, wait a second, if you turn that off, the following god-awful thing is going to happen, and it's going to be your fault. And, it just seems like this may be one where, having seen it in advance, being more active at the FCC to kind of really either bully pulpit it or even, I don't know if there's any regulatory way to deal with it, but to do something to make sure that they're not in that situation out there, because it could really, it wouldn't take too much to really stymie progress at some point if there's some really important, life critical type application that just can't move for whatever reason.
Yeah, so our initial proposal is to do a policy, or the FCC to do a policy statement. It sounds like you want something much stronger.
A policy statement may be enough, but I guess what I'm saying is that maybe our advice to the FCC is figure out the strongest thing you can do. It's kind of hard to figure out how you'd make a regulation about that. That doesn't make sense. But, this isn't just one of those policy statements you write and throw on the floor. This is one that they have to find a way to really drive into the industry with what the ramifications of not following it are, because otherwise we could really hamstring, the technology 10 years out. We saw something like that when analog phones were getting turned off and a whole bunch of cars that had, automatic reporting systems went offline, basically. But that was pretty minor, really. And, the cost of upgrading those cars was pretty high, so most people I don't think did. But you could see, creating just an untenable situation for carriers N years out if the wrong things happen.
Henning, go ahead.
So just to follow up on that particular issue, is we have a similar problem in some sense at a much shorter time scale for Section 214 notifications when a carrier discontinues a particular service, which presumably is also meant to give entities that rely on that network a little bit of time, usually days measured in months in that, as opposed to years. So I wonder if there's if you look at operating system vendors, and indeed network equipment vendors, they typically have an end-of-life planning for equipment that often extends out. If you look at Windows XP as a recent example, that caused some amount of surprise in people that have ATMs and cash registers and gas pumps and who knows what else. Even though I don't think it should have, it was hardly news, is there a model for an end-of-life for network services where you would have a phased model, no new services, security updates only type of thing to basically sorry, out of luck type of model? Is that a viable model as opposed to simply saying thou shalt not rely on a network being around forever?
I think the difference is with the OS thing, what tends to happen is some number of people continue to run it anyway, and an aftermarket develops of third parties that support it. In a case like this, if you want to repurpose the spectrum, then that's just not going to be available. So on the surface, I just don't see that as the option. That's sort of why we went for what I guess I refer to as a containment approach. Right, try to contain the long-lived stuff in areas where you have high spatial reuse, and maybe you can allow it to hang around, and really discourage it from using the parts of the spectrum where you really expect to disallow use over time.
It's really two parts, and you make an important distinction. Namely, one is early warning in the sense that you provide everybody, so as in if you deploy something 5 years, has and I'm not sure that has always happened. And the other one is you point out the important distinction that for the laggards and other technologies, they can operate at their own risk, which doesn't really apply. They don't really imply, so the same social cost issues don't apply for operating systems as they apply for spectrum usage. So, but I was more concerned about the former, namely a more predictable model, so that you don't get I didn't know. I don't pay attention to whatever. So
that actually would, even in the approach we're suggesting, the gateways and proxies, that'd still be a massive job to upgrade those, right? And so that kind of EOL notice would be important. I'm sorry, Kevin.
So at least that job is doable. Whereas if devices if the architecture is designed such that devices are all reporting back directly, you may well be in a situation where it's just not doable because these are devices that are physically embedded into our world infrastructure, right? And if you don't encourage a proxy approach, you're screwed totally. And I'm just saying, that's the kind of thing. Somehow we got to get a big warning flag.
And I'll say personally, this has been an eye opener for me. As the team's probably sick of hearing, from me. I really came into this. I don't like proxies. I don't like those. It's architecturally, I really prefer the home run. But I've just sort of accepted that for the reasons Kevin captured it really clearly. That we'll get into a situation where there's just no path forward.
This challenge with this is George, is that one yours or is it Greg's? Greg's, okay. If you guys, especially the people on the line, if you would turn it so that I can see whose name I'm trying to figure out.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
But Russ, we've talked about this before, but perhaps your group should also coordinate with an industry group like NFPA, where they actually make rules that get followed by fire departments. If you don't follow the NFPA rules, then a fire happens and you're liable, and every fire chief knows that. So, and they rewrite or update their regulations annually. And I really think that your group, in working in conjunction with someone over there, would be very valuable.
Okay, Nomi.
I wanted to ask. Sorry, I wanted to ask about the second bullet on the strawman recommendation slide about the mechanisms should be provided to authenticate the provenance of IoT source data. And I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit. I just wanted to maybe reference it also just from the authentication end, just that I think that I think we have so much innovation ahead of us in the area of authentication. When I think about today's broadband systems, they largely use the same authentication that was used 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think we have a lot of innovation to come in that area, and so I just think that we need to be careful with how we approach this area, and that we leave a lot of room for innovation. It feels like much is burgeoning in that area, and to be too rigid in this area could derail innovation, if that makes sense. So I think we have to be careful. Like, we don't want to build something that assumes today's methods of authentication is how we handle that going forward, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Adam?
So actually sort of two different areas. I would say the first one is spectrum. And if I look at what the TAC has been dealing with over the last couple of years, we've been looking at receiver standards because of a spectrum problem, or the way spectrum is used. And the other one is that we are sort of allocating spectrum for what looks like a short-term need today, okay, which is more spectrum for broadband tuned to how I pass video, things of that sort. Okay? So when you take a look at the IoT world, in fact, sort of long-range planning, does that have any strong implications for whether we should be reconsidering what the use of spectrum is and how it's used in the first place, beyond just spatial diversity? So I'd say that's issue number one. I'd say the second one deals with proxies, things of that sort, okay, and that is, are there any kind of useful thoughts to be had on how you number or name things in the IoT space beyond what we do today? So I'd say those two areas essentially.
Any comments, Russ? David?
So on the proxies, we have talked about registries a bit and how we could look, we looked into that. The initial direction we came away with, or decision we came away with, was we didn't see a really high need for registries other than potentially life-critical type applications or things that would connect. Many devices are going to be deployed privately. Do you really need a registry? I don't know if that gets to some of your proxy point. But there's probably a piece there, though, and maybe going back to the comment earlier about the National Fire, where there's some critical issues where you may want to have certain things registered that there may be that evolves out of this.
Let me give you a concrete example.
Okay.
I live in Dallas, Texas. I have a intrusion alarm system. Okay. For that system to call my local police, I have to have a separate registration with the police and a number. Otherwise, they will not respond to the call. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So when you start taking a look at, what's the utility of an IoT device or something of that sort, sort of Metcalfe's law really does apply. How do I discover those things? How do I reuse them? How do I publish them? Okay. And, my contention would be that naming conventions and registrations really do serve some additional values. Okay. Now, they could be commercially done, okay, but I have a feeling, again, as you build goods for a global economy, it's worthwhile putting some thought into it.
Point taken. Let me give you an example back. For instance, a Nest thermometer. Is that something you see needing a registration? To Google, I think it's something that would need a registration so they could use it. But from a general Internet of Things, is there any value to registering that device?
If I'm initializing meteorological data and I can get temperatures all over the place, hell yes. Because the network exists,
now we have
that
privacy
wouldn't have
issues,
existed
though.
anywhere. Okay?
Yeah.
If I have devices on cars that measure ozone or something of that sort, again, I could use that data for another purpose. I can't unless it's registered.
I get your point, Adam. I think some of the things you're talking about could be part of a crowdsourcing effort on data capture that still don't really require registration. It could be location. We will consider that point, though, as a working group. At least on Spectrum, you made a comment that Spectrum's being used sort of designed for today's needs. That's kind of always, that's the way Spectrum, I guess, evolves. Who would have seen where we are with Spectrum today with smartphones 10 years ago? In fact, I was watching a movie where these people went back to 1980 a couple nights ago, and it was like, what's email? So it's like the spectrum continues to evolve, I think. And so what we're calling out, there's no unique spectrum requirements that we see currently required for IoT today. One of the discussions we had in our meeting today was potentially about the overhead that surrounds that. Somebody brought up the point, I think it was Kevin maybe, about the overhead for streaming. If everything's designed for streaming today and you try to do short, IoT, messaging with that overhead, that could become a problem. But that'll get adjusted too by industry, I believe. So yes, Spectrum will be sort of designed du jour or utilized du jour based on the apps and needs. But I think it'll continue to evolve just as well. Tweets didn't exist 3 years ago. Was it 3?
Yep.
Okay, I think our time for discussion of IoT is ended, and Jesse, do you have a quick one?
No, I think it's quick.
Okay.
Russ, I think it might be helpful with this move towards spectrum sharing. If during the taxonomy, if you guys could look into traffic characteristics or bursty traffic versus symmetrical, asymmetrical, because it has a lot to do with where we're going in terms of FDD, TDD type systems to support IoT.
Excellent point. We've considered and actually see it as one of our next steps. It's not called out here, but the impact to upstream traffic, we see, the change in terms of the dynamics of symmetry of broadband networks could become it could have pressure on the upstream side.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was a great last one, so thank you, Jesse. glad we added that one in. All right, let's move on to our next topic, the Spectrum and Receiver Performance Group. Lynn Cloudy, you're on. And I think he's waiting for the clicker if Russ would pass it down. No. We have been instructed. For the new members of the TAC, you'll not appreciate this, but our former chairman of the TAC, now chairman of the FCC, had the audacity at one point to flip the clicker across the room, and he was severely chastised for doing so. So the decorum has been reestablished in passing.
Was to make them
the punishment was that exactly right, yes.
No. As a result of that, he decided to become chairman, so he would never be chastised again.
Next chairman.
Okay.
All right, Lynn, you're on.
That's a ban on that right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is on the screen the mission of the working group as it was presented at the March 2014 TAC meeting. So we are targeting to have recommendations on improving access to and making efficient use of radio spectrum from a system point of view and a receiver point of view, to provide support to the FCC as they consider the TAC recommendations that we have previously made on interference limits policy, and to conduct analyses and make recommendations related to enforcement issues in this rapidly changing RF environment. In other words, enforcement in the modern communications era we find ourselves now. These are the participants in our working group. They span a large range of capabilities and contexts. It is a bigger group than it was in previous years, and that's a good thing. We still have the stellar support from the FCC staff with leadership and guidance from Julie Knapp, and very hard effort and day-to-day work from Bob Pavlak, and the technical perspectives of the others from the OET staff. So we really don't have excuses for not having the appropriate people involved. And we appreciate everyone that's contributing, and pretty much everyone is contributing. So that's our organization. These are the areas of focus, and again, this was from the March meeting, essentially, and brought up to date. We had some white papers and some briefings that were promised to the group, and I'll talk about those. We were also to develop a charter for a multi-stakeholder group, and we are going to develop recommendations about the statistics of interference and assess technical topics on receiver performance. We also had activities related to interference, resolution enforcement, and radio noise, and recommended in March that the FCC share information about interference incidents, investigate noise floor impact on existing and future radio services, and recommend some strategies to address RF environment challenges. So those continue to be our areas of focus as they were in March. Today, first of all, we hope to publish a paper with approval from the TAC on interference, resolution enforcement, and radio noise. This gives credit primarily to Dale Hatfield as the principal author, but we got lots of editors also in the working group, and it has been a group effort. This white paper was sent to the entire TAC for review 1 week ago on June 3rd, and we have not received, or I don't think Dale has received, unfortunately Dale is not here today, but I have not, and Bob Pavlak have not, and I don't think Dale has received any negative comments about the report. So with a week of review, Mr. Chairman, if it's appropriate, we'd like to ask for acceptance of that report, at which time we would be able to put it on the public TAC website.
This would be your last opportunity. Are there any comments outstanding or edits or suggestions to this document at this point? Hopefully you all have had an opportunity to review it, at least at some level. Notion of the 1 week in advance. Not seeing any tent cards or any hands waving, so I think that we will presume acceptance and publish away.
Thank you very much. Secondly, back to the slides, we had a subgroup of our working group consisting of Jeff Mendenhall, Dave Gurney, and Greg Lappin, who put together a presentation on the impact of emerging receiver technologies on changing standards and spectrum allocations. The TAC members and FCC staff, certain FCC staff, were invited to see this presentation, which was held this morning here at the FCC up on the second floor. Some of you were there. A lot of people were there. We had something like 35 people in the room and probably 24, maybe more, on the phone. So it was a well-attended briefing and a well-prepared briefing, we thought. They covered receiver hardware, dynamic interference mitigation techniques, and talked about the opportunities and the status of software-defined radio as an emerging technology. So that was another deliverable we promised back in March. As a matter of due diligence, we have followed through on that, and it seems to have been successful. And if you weren't able to make the meeting, I understand the slides will be available after they're fine-tuned a little bit to make sure they're okay for TAC member consumption. And if you have any questions about any of that, you can feel free to write Jeff Mendenhall, Dave Gurney, and Greg Lappin on the individual parts of that presentation. Multi-stakeholder organizations are a critical part of the overall interference limits policy approach that the working group has been working on for the past year, I guess over the past year. And the TAC published a lengthy white paper, again, principal author on that, credit to Pierre DeVries, a lengthy white paper on that, and then a more human-focused summary version that was published in March of this year. Specifically, the MSH organizations come into that when there's a need for multiple stakeholders in a particular band to develop parameter values for the harm claim thresholds that are necessary in an interference limits policy kind of environment. So we've previously provided briefing material to this group and in the white papers, and that's more or less general about what is an MSH organization. But we had committed to drafting a charter for what such a group would look like in terms of its organization and its governance and its relationship to industry and to government. And that would be something that could potentially fit into existing or future FCC proceedings on spectrum management topics that affect multiple stakeholders. Under the leadership of Doug Brake from ITIF in our group, we did produce a draft of a charter for an MSH organization, and that also was sent to the full TAC for review. However, it was sent last Friday, and worse than that, it was sent last Friday night. So while we would love to say, are there any comments, and if so, if there are none, we'll just move forward in consultation with Chairman Roberson. I think we would like to give a week for TAC members to look at that charter, and if there are no comments that we can't resolve in just an editorial fashion, then we will go ahead and publish that charter for consumption by the TAC and anyone that looks at the TAC website as an example. Did I represent that?
No, that's terrific.
More or less.
Are there any weekend warriors who had a chance to dig in and digest the multi-stakeholder proposal? Any comments for Lynn and the group? Not seeing any. These are quite substantive documents, so I'm hopeful that you are taking advantage of the opportunity to dig in and review them. And these do come out as both the previous document and this document do come out under the banner of the full TAC. So, if you will, you all own these documents. So it is quite helpful if you would review them to have that imprimatur of your ownership properly assigned. So please take advantage of the next week to review this document, and get your inputs into Lynn in this case to be sent on to Doug and others.
I do have one quick question.
Please.
Multi-stakeholder is probably one of these words. If you were to look at Google search results, it's sort of a distinct uptick in the last year or two. In other areas, not so much spectrum, but internet governance and so on. So I wonder how much you've looked at what models, particularly in terms of consensus finding or non-consensus breaking, namely how do you deal with bodies in multi-stakeholder where you cannot reach consensus, you have looked at in those areas as to how they might be applicable or not applicable to your particular effort. I skimmed the document briefly. I didn't see much on that. That may have been a deliberate omission simply because you see it as so disjoint that there is no from internet governance type of efforts or standardization efforts for that matter, where you also have supposedly, even though it's not called that, a multi-stakeholder model, for example, in many of the standardization organizations, IETF, 3GPP, and so on.
Yeah, I think the charter is perhaps more on the idealistic level, and it does use the word consensus liberally, but without defining it. And, of course, in standards organizations, that's one of the very first and difficult topics is to decide what does consensus mean. In the case of the charter that we put together, I think our answer was, well, this is kind of uncharted territory. If it works, it'll be very useful to the FCC. If you cannot reach consensus on a particular item, maybe you need to adjust your goals to move downward and say, well, if we can't actually decide on harm claim threshold values, maybe we can at least decide on measurement techniques that should be used and leave the actual parameter values in the regulatory hands. So you're right, we didn't deal with the actual what ifs. What if you can't do all the things you think you're trying to do? Some of that would be left up within the group to say what kind of consensus model makes sense to this group for a particular purpose in a particular context. But there are things that are not fully dealt with, and I think that's a proper comment to consider further.
Carry on.
Okay. Next, we go on to things that we haven't produced outputs on yet, but have interest in. This particular work item is on statistics of interference, and that work is underway, but it is not by any means at the end of the process. This is kind of a narrative slide, so it actually makes sense to kind of tell the story as the slide does. Basically, the causes and consequences of RF interference events vary greatly. They vary greatly across diverse radio services and industries, so understanding and predicting the risk requires some statistical analysis of the particular scenarios. So you have kind of a qualitative sense that overall risk is the probability of something happening multiplied by the size of what that something would be. And typically, just looking at worst cases of interference, which is where a lot of regulatory decisions have been and are made, worst case analysis tells you about really bad things that could happen, but it doesn't tell you much about what's the probability of that actually happening. Is that something we should worry about? And it turns out that there are other regulated industries that have looked at this kind of multifaceted risk-based analysis. They just don't happen to be in spectrum planning. Although the wireless industry, I think, has some experience there in statistical analysis and Monte Carlo techniques. But overall, this activity is about making recommendations that would extend the FCC's toolkit to include statistically based methods and metrics in putting together rules and analysis of what constitutes harmful interference. The first work item in this has been to look at statistical interference metrics by the FCC. Is there anything in the past? And statistical risk analysis that's used in other regulated industries. So we've kind of gone through some of that analysis, and when I say we, I mean Pierre DeVries and a few others. And we're planning to review the use of statistical techniques within industry as opposed to government, but look at those techniques and how they're used in industry next. So for the third quarter of this year, we'll take a look at past FCC proceedings and see, with how those things turned out, would it have turned out differently, or would it have been useful if they could have had risk-informed hazard assessment techniques in application to spectrum management topics? And hopefully in the fourth quarter we'll be able to make some recommendations in those areas to the FCC. The acronym that goes along with this is RIDM, which stands for Risk-Informed Decision Making. And we've gotten a briefing of the group from the experience of all things, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. For obvious reasons, they care a lot about risk because life and safety is paramount in there. So as opposed to simply saying, well, we'll put a safety margin in there as a backstop against having any problems, and having just a deterministic, this is our margin. For over 10 years, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has had the computing power available and the methods developed to use RIDM techniques for licensing requirements and regulatory decisions in their area of expertise. And at least for them, this has had some real benefits that can be extrapolated to groups at large, in that you can get a deeper understanding of the root causes of what actually causes system failures and what are the probabilities of those things happening. And it brings people together for communications about how to solve those very specific problems. And it's just a better modeling tool generally than trying to worst case everything, which is a lot of what is done today out of pretty much out of necessity and out of tradition. This is a more complex kind of way to do things. It's hard to estimate what the errors might be, and certainly it's not the way generally that things are done, especially in the FCC context. So this would be this is new territory. It would require new regulations and new regulatory approach, but we will be investigating this more, talking more about it in subsequent TAC meetings. So consider this just kind of a preview, not a very information-informed presentation on this topic. So I'm rationalizing why we don't have a detailed evaluation yet, but we've just started looking at it. So RIDM, good acronym to remember. On our work item on technical topics of receiver performance, at least one major item is done, which was the survey of emerging receiver technologies in our briefing that took place this morning. Going forward, we plan to see if we can find commonalities among key receiver performance factors across all kinds of services, things that would be relevant to disparate industries that find themselves in a coexistence scenario in nearby spectrum or the same spectrum, even if those services are really in vastly different kinds of categories. We also plan to review industry activities and standardization of receivers and look for the kinds of opportunities where cross-industry coordination would be beneficial and could be exploited to advantage in trying to achieve greater spectrum efficiency. So kind of the umbrella name of wireless coexistence and looking at cross-system issues is what we're talking about, and inter-system interference issues, something the FCC is particularly interested in these days. So it involves propagation models, it involves receiver characteristics, and it involves performance metrics that are currently used by industry and government. Then our last topic of interference resolution enforcement and radio noise, of course, we have and thank you very much, completed milestone today for the white paper. And again, the opportunity of recognizing Dale Hatfield and Silicon Flatiron's staff for working so hard on that. There's also a reminder on here of our previous recommendations to the FCC that are enshrined in that white paper as well, to look towards releasing summary information on interference complaints, even those that are resolved without regulation, and in trying to scope the problem of what is the real task of enforcement in the modern era. And we also have the recommendation that the FCC convene 2 workshops, one on interference resolution and enforcement generally, and one on noise floor characterization, which is a hard topic to get a handle on, the rise of the RF noise floor. And in the group discussion, we finally came around to saying, well, maybe having a workshop and having different industries come in and talk about the rise of noise floor in their particular context would be helpful when you get all those people together and find out what some of the commonalities are and what some of the studies that have or have not been done or that need to be done. So second half of this year, we will focus on the idea of this public-private partnership to have a forum to share systematically information about interference incidents and also to recommend general strategies on interference resolution and enforcement as they're laid out and developed somewhat in the white paper. Our other major milestones are here. Our second quarter milestones are completed, or perhaps in a week the second one will be completed with the charter for the multi-stakeholder group achieving completed status. Then in the third and fourth quarter, our goals are to convene these workshops, hopefully, if the FCC agrees it's a good idea. Those are on interference resolution enforcement and radio noise, and to analyze the past FCC proceedings for an entry point into the use of risk-informed decision-making techniques for interference harm analysis. And can we go back to the slides? There we go. I'll go forward. I just talked about that. Third and fourth quarter of 14, we hope to have recommendations on the use of these risk-informed techniques and a list of technical questions to industry about receiver performance standards. Are there commonalities that people need to know about receivers that would help them if they're going to be in a sharing kind of situation or have to deal with intersystem interference? So that's trying to understand commonalities among different industries and the requisite requirements for wireless coexistence. And with that, that's the end of our update. Most of the members of the working group, although not all, are here, so if you have particular questions, I'm perfectly capable of pointing at the right person to answer those questions and invite you to do so.
All right, 10 cards up. People have questions, comments? Not seeing anyone jumping to their microphone. All right. Completely lucid, absolutely clear.
Yeah.
Crystal clear. So let's move on then and move to our sharing team. And it's always is a great joy to have the great tight teamwork that's so well known between AT&T and Verizon and in leading our efforts here. So Brian, I take it you are leading since you've got the microphone.
I've got the microphone, I've got the remote, so we're set to go.
Very good.
Okay, I'd like to present the Advanced Sharing and Enabling Wireless Technologies Working Group report, so if we can get those on the screen.
So I'm just going to let them know this. We've got this one loop to go through to see something here for the cyber.
There we go. Just a quick review of our charter. We're looking at establishing an advanced sharing framework so we can enhance spectrum efficiency and protecting those incumbent services using those spectrum, both federal and non-federal services. We want to identify and evaluate enabling technologies to enhance sharing and develop requirements for protection of incumbent services, and also to encourage coexistence of federal and non-federal systems. And finally, provide recommendations to the Commission regarding the establishment and objectives of an RF model city where the proposed advanced sharing framework and enabling technologies can be tested and evaluated. We're co-leading the group between Verizon and AT&T. Sanyugita is not present today. I'm not sure if she's on the phone or not. Do we have the bridge up?
She had to drop off.
She had to drop off, okay. We do have a number of FCC liaisons and a number of participants and guest speakers, and I want to thank all those that are participating in the working group. We certainly do appreciate their inputs. Progress to date, we have reviewed various sharing models and implementations, including exclusive license model, unlicensed models, white space database, 3.5 gigahertz DAS, and the SysMac and others. We've created 2 sub-working groups to dive into the enabling technologies and database structure, and Milo will give a more detailed report on the database structure progress to date in a few moments. And then we're focusing on key areas for recommendations, including interference cancellation, in-building only service, database architecture and compatibility, and the RF model city. We've had a couple of presentations from DARPA on their spectrum allocation under 6 gigahertz, looking at the progress from 1980 to the present and focusing in the future out to 2020, looking at where the different divisions and dynamic frequency select bands exist today, and also the opportunities for a win-win capability increase as we move out into the future with increased sharing. We're looking at a number of various sharing types. The basic principles of sharing are looking at multiple spectrum users and looking at various dimensions that we can separate those multiple spectrum users in space, time, and or frequency. In separation of space, we're looking at the primary and secondary systems in mutually exclusive and non-overlapping areas of space, allowing them to use the same channel concurrently. In separation of time, the primary and secondary systems operate in the same space and frequency, but transmit at mutually exclusive times, thereby avoiding interfering with one another. And then a separation in frequency is where we dynamically assign different frequencies to primary and secondary systems, allowing concurrent operations both in space and time. This slide goes a little bit more detailed into the sharing types in space, where we have space around the primary where secondaries can operate, and we have these exclusion zones where we have the primary user and other users are excluded from using the area around those exclusion zones. And these are static or permanent exclusion zones around those primary systems. With these, we do need an accurate estimate of the exclusion zone and secondary geolocation based on static propagation model based or augmented with dynamic measurements by the of the primary by the secondary systems. The second sharing type is in time, and this is where at a slow time scale, it's dynamically assigned time windows for use in the same space, creating dynamic exclusion zones around the primary. Examples of that would be TV stations with well-defined transmission times, or an exclusion zone around naval radar as the radar platform moves. For these sharing in time, you would need an accurate estimate of changes in the exclusion zones and closed-loop information flow between the primary and secondary systems so you can convey when the exclusion zones would be in effect. The next is aggressive sharing in space and time. On a fast scale via MAC protocols, the secondary systems operate in the exclusion zone and transmit when they find opportunities. This is where the secondary systems will need to listen before they talk, and the secondary systems will have to have smart sensing and cognitive functionality in order to determine when they're available in order for them to transmit. Some of the FCC implementations of sharing, different approaches to enable sharing, including dynamic frequency sensing and switching, e.g. used in 5 gigahertz, spectrum coordination through static exclusion zones planned for AWS, database approach to spectrum management, such as static and passive spectrum coordination in TV white space, where a database will simply provide a list of available spectrum and the usage would follow unlicensed type access, and static rules for maximum power level and masks would be needed. The dynamic spectrum access system, SAS pilots in 3.5 gigahertz, where a granular time and location frequency and dynamic approach to spectrum management. A database reassigns specific channels and sets the maximum power levels based on deployment, and this supports 3 tiers of access, including priority and licensed access and general authorized access. I'll give the Enabling Technologies Sub-Working Group update. Their first call took place May 22nd. They had an excellent presentation from Frank Sanders of NTIA on radars. The NTIA performed test of interference to LTE from radars, and the report with test results will be released. They do have planned activities on interfering cancellation technology, including interference cancellation at an LTE receiver and potential interference cancellation of LTE signals at an incumbent receiver, and also planned activities on indoor-only services, such as identification of potential bands to consider and incumbent system types and propagation profiles over a range of frequencies for various building materials. And I'll turn it over to Milo to give the database structure subgroup working group update.
Great, thank you. So our subgroup met once on June 5th. The charter is to develop the requirements for the architecture and interfaces of an advanced spectrum sharing database and investigate options for improving the efficiency and capability of database operation by increased coordination among the licensee systems. The express focus on this is not in the 3.5 docket, but actually beyond what has been discussed with regards to database operations there. Next slide. So there are several areas that we're looking at to study. Sort of in the core architecture and database processes, PCAST talked about 3 tiers, but in reality, you don't really necessarily have to have just 3 tiers, right? There can be a broad range of sharing that's possible. And can the SaaS, basically, or the database system, move up the food chain and start taking on some capabilities of more like a radio resource management system? That could allow, for example, to have multiple levels of interference protection. So you actually could understand what the interference characteristics are of the band before getting registered and becoming able to access in it. Coexistence of the high tier and low tier operations when the high tier is idle, for example, not to have relatively static allocations but increase the dynamicism. And then what kind of practical granularity can we leverage from that separation in space, frequency, and time? Different models of operations allow us to potentially get, if the database can support this, even better abilities to share. Interference modeling and prediction. Obviously, indoor versus outdoor matters a whole lot, and having the database be able to take into account different modeling opportunities to optimize license boundaries and assignment boundaries can also drive efficiency. And then what kind of data is useful to make available to users, right? So the semantic of the database is not just from a transaction, but what can the database create in terms of transparent access to what's going on in the spectrum so that potential users could actually understand better about what they're getting into and how that changes over time. Then talking about other areas in terms of optimizations to drive efficiency. So, for example, can we coordinate users better? We talked about this in the PCAST days, but if you had a timing standard that TDD users could synchronize, you could reduce the amount of separation both in frequency and space as an optimization. If 2 users both want access to the same piece of spectrum in the same area and are normally mutually exclusive, could the database come back and say, go down in power to avoid mutual exclusivity? So there's this kind of model of where the database actually takes on more of a broker role. We think could add opportunities for efficiency. Another area where we think there's a lot of interesting opportunities are if the nodes, if the users are actually reporting back data about what they're seeing in terms of interference, what kind of operations is going on. Now the system, the database can actually take that into account in how it assigns spectrum and what its what the possibilities are in terms of mitigating interference. If you know that users are interfering, then we can optimize the propagation models that are being used by the database, and again, do a better job of protection. And learning from usage, right? If the users actually are reporting back not just interference, but also how they're using the band, how they're using that particular piece of spectrum, that also can create a data that can be used to drive additional sharing. And obviously, there are implications on enforcement and compliance. If you've got users who are coming back and saying, I'm seeing this kind of interference, the database knows who's been authorized. And so potentially you can detect devices that are operating outside of guidelines, outside of the license regime, based on what the data that's coming back from your systems are telling you. So there's a lot of opportunities here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The other area we're looking at is the RF model city. We have reviewed the PCAST report and discussed the earlier concept of the proposed RF model test city. We do understand that the FCC and NTIA are planning to announce how to advance the PCAST recommendations on the RF model city, and the working group will engage in various discussions and provide its contributions once the further details are announced. So the next steps for the September meeting, we plan further analysis and investigation. The working groups will continue their work. We'll have the updates from each of the working groups, and we'll identify sharing opportunities specific to bands that have been identified by the working groups, and all working toward actionable recommendations for the December TAC meeting. That concludes the report.
Very good. Thank you. Lots of content there, and this is obviously another hot area for us. I think, Kevin, you were the first up. So,
yeah, the question for Milo, since I missed his sub-working group meeting, since we're explicitly looking beyond the 3.5 gigahertz band, and these are much more advanced, multi-tier forms of systems and more dynamic, are you looking at a particular frequency band or range as a target for where these might be applied, or is the work independent of what band it may be used in?
I think we're trying to focus on more along the lines of what the semantics of interacting with the database and what the database needs to do to support operations in a wide variety of bands. So the work group overall is looking at a number of bands. And so I think this, as a subgroup, we're trying to coordinate that with the rest of the team's work.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah?
Yes. I was wondering if the Spectrum Sharing Working Group was aware of or had taken a look at a technology application recently developed by Technical University of Braunschweig, Germany, and Gates Air called Tower Overlay. This is an application where a digital television transmitter can be used to transmit simultaneously a 6 megahertz or an 8 megahertz DTV waveform and an LTE waveform on a time division multiplex basis.
No, that's not something that we have looked at as of yet, but I'd like to get in touch with you after, and perhaps we can bring it into the working group.
I'll get you some information on that. It was just recently demonstrated at the NAB show in Las Vegas. So it's an interesting application.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Lynn would support this enthusiastically. Pierre?
Yeah, this is a point on the database structure working group. It's a wonderful lineup of work, and I think one of the things I'm very pleased to see is the focus on enforcement. It's actually a good link to the white paper that we just approved earlier, because there's a short section in there, and one of the things it says is that interference resolution enforcement is something you need to consider early in the design of a SAS, so it's great to see that you're doing this. Just a couple of things, you're just beginning to scope it out. Two things that I've heard people talk about that I found very useful to scope it out. One is, in this community we talk about enforcement, but we actually mean many things by it. So what I found it means is three things: monitoring, adjudication, and enforcement. So monitoring is actually what's going on. And it's not necessarily bad things going on. It could just be the FCC made certain assumptions when it wrote the rules. Are those assumptions, in fact, panning out? And if they're not panning out, do we need to change something? And then there's also the question of, okay, now bad things are happening. That then goes to adjudication, which is so something bad happens. I think it's bad. You think it's okay. Who decides whether it's bad or not? And there's a question, I think, an important question about which decisions the SAS can take, which decisions have to go back to the FCC, and which decisions can be taken somewhere else.
Right.
And then the third one is enforcement, which is so now a decision has been taken, yes, you were speeding. So who actually enforces it? Again, are there things where the SAS can enforce without recourse to the FCC, or are there others where the FCC can do it? The other thing, which I think is a useful distinction, you actually have it implicitly in the two bullets that you have here, are ex ante and ex post. Because your one example, which is, restricting to compliant modes, is ex ante.
Right.
Whereas, detecting devices that are doing bad things is ex post. And so that's also, Martin Weiss has talked about that a lot. That's a very useful distinction to make.
Very good. Thank you.
Good. Jesse.
Maybe it's along the same lines in terms of enforcement, but it has to do, have you guys looked at the security aspects of these types of databases where you're actually building in the concept of enforcement?
I think the general guidelines that we've been looking at are that the interactions with the database are done using cryptographic mechanisms, right, that identify both that you're talking to the real database and that the authorization is valid, but also that the devices themselves or the users who are interacting with the database would be known, right, and would be cryptographically authenticated. So I think at that level we've thought some of that through. I think if you think about consumer devices where a device vendor builds an access point, the user isn't necessarily interacting with that system, or you're not authenticating that user. You're authenticating that vendor's device, and that vendor's device is compliant, right? But you also know who it is, right? You know what the device is, and the question is, what kind of data should we put in, right, in that set of interactions? Whether do you actually go into the user context? So these are subjects that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I think my question was really more aligned. You're trying to adjudicate between two users that are sharing the same space, quote unquote, right? And you've got a database that can actually have an impact on how one performs versus the other.
Sure.
Which could seriously impact the economic benefits of one versus the other. And so I was just saying that I think it would be very helpful as you think through how you administer the database, if you look at how do you secure the information that's making those sort of dynamic decisions about the allocation of the bandwidth, right?
Okay, thank you.
Michael.
Yeah, so just following on Pierre's some of the comments about authorization and the enforcement. I think one of the interesting questions is that at the end of the day, who makes that decision to authorize the device to transmit? Is that going to be a database, which is more centralized and collects all the data and then makes the final call, or does a device get smaller and smaller with the different sensing technologies, and then based on some information they get from the central database, the user device and device finally makes the call, and depends on which model we go with, some of the enforcement, authorization, and all that discussion will have different dimensions. So I hope that the working group will try to come up with, some comparisons of, contrast of advantages or disadvantages of these two models and see how we can benefit from, I'm sure there will be some band dependencies and so forth. So we really look forward to some of the outcomes on the next meeting.
You may want to flip down your cards as you complete them. If there aren't any other questions or comments, I have quite a few myself. And part of this comes from the fact that just returned from a week actually a week plus in Europe. And in Europe, as many of you know, the licensed shared access or authorized shared access is all the rage, and there is very little attention paid to SAS. And in fact, when it's brought up, you're looked at as though you're a bit odd, which is very, very nice, helpful slap in the face for people who have lived in the SAS world and PCAST and all the rest, looking at Milo here. So I was struck, given this experience over the last week of LSA, ASA, that there's no mention of that notion in the sharing. So is that purposeful, or how do you see that?
Well, I think, again, this is going beyond the effort that's focused at 3.5. I think if you think about ASA, LSA, it is a specific case of the more general purpose interaction between users and a database. And I think we've even talked about, for example, you could use one semantic for GAA or unlicensed style users accessing the spectrum through a database. And you could use ASA, LSA as another mechanism of doing that. The question is whether or not you have to decide at the beginning that you're only operating in a relatively simple two-tier model, or are more open models available. I think this is an area where the U.S. is actually providing more leadership in this space, and it's a bigger, more complex problem to solve, but one that I think can actually yield a better outcome in terms of a better diversity of devices, and avoids the case of having to decide who are the shared users, right? What is the limitations of the context of the kind of entity that can actually gain access to shared spectrum?
Although the way it is being characterized is actually taking a note out of history that this is GSM versus CDMA all over again. GSM simpler and won the day, at least in the first round. In the later rounds, of course, CDMA is the basis for everything we do. But it's an interesting one that I think the group ought to at least address at some level, because it's
totally right.
Semantically very interesting. And this second area of complexity, relative complexity, and there have been U.S. authors who've written about this, that this is so, it almost does harken back to the CDMA days. This is so incredibly complex, no one will ever be able to implement this.
Well, I don't think it is that complex, but a lot of this
but people, I'm only quoting some of the authors. And some of that has been picked up very strongly in Europe, and that's the rolling of the eyes as you talk about SAS. That's the Americans with their incredibly complex
much of this
ideas.
is being handled in the 3.5 docket, which we can't actually deal with in this context. So
No, not that. But I think in the generic, you don't want to do 3.5, but in the generic, since you're dealing with sharing, it's something that's worthy of discussion. The other item is relatively small item. You consistently, this is more Brian's side, you consistently talked about exclusion zones. I think in the NTIA side, this notion of coordination zones became more in vogue, so you may want to think about that just from a terminology standpoint. You may decide not to use it, but I just struck with where the conversations were in that forum versus where the conversations are here.
Take that under consideration.
Thank you. Great.
Just thinking about this, and maybe for the group to talk a little bit about setting aside the policy issues, how many tiers we have and what's priority access. The whole concept here is looked upon, I think, by incumbents as primarily a concept. And to the extent that there was some collaboration in industry to take things and maybe build fundamental prototypes and to start to build confidence with people that these things actually do the things that they're claimed to do. Because I know when I talk to incumbents, they worry about those. They worry about issues like Jesse brought up about security. Okay, you set it up and it can work. What's going to happen if something goes awry? So maybe thinking a little bit about that, how we take things and build them from the concepts to actually trying these things out beyond what we're doing in white spaces. Might be something that the group could think about a bit more.
And that may be in the context of actionable recommendations. That may be something that would fit into that space, because I'm still always anxious to find more actionable recommendations. This is a mantra for us. All right, I see no more tent cards, and the time is moving, so let's move on to our next topic, cybersecurity work group, and
David Simpson, head of public safety.
Yeah, the George, Adam, and Mike show, and
I'm going to give up my seat, and Admiral Simpson will sit here.
Okay. And we actually are very pleased and honored to have Admiral Simpson join us, who some of you may know has somewhat recently taken over the responsibility for the important bureau that deals with cybersecurity, among other things, but public safety. And welcome to our forum.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Great. Did you have any opening words that you'd like to share? Put you on the spot?
Yeah, just to thank the TAC for convening around cybersecurity. It's so important in virtually all of the issues that you're grappling with, not just within this subgroup, but in the other areas as well. I was particularly encouraged to hear Naomi bring up the importance of authentication and earlier numbering as well. It's just embedded in the way we communicate, and if you think like an attacker, you're always looking for that opportunity for a man in the middle of the attack, for a kind of attack where you're looked at as a regular authorized user of networks. So just the other day, Forbes had an article about RF hacking, where a smart professor in Columbia in a $100 drone figured out how to get into broadcast media. Now that broadcast media is connected in the back end in a hybrid way to the internet, virtually all of the communication sectors have to consider, as we go forward, an aspect of security. We're concerned that maybe in the long term, as companies rationalize their R&D around things they can control, that we may be missing sector-wide opportunities to apply R&D and just change the way we as a sector approach securing communications and baking it in across all of the companies. And so we met with Paul Steinberg, and in the second phase of what the TAC looks at, we hope to further explore those kinds of, boy, can we get a big win by committing to some architectural changes that would impact all of the players in a sector, but rising tide lifts all boats.
Great. Thank you. Again, welcome. Thanks. George, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, Paul Steinberg couldn't be here today, so I'll be presenting part of our status. In addition, we have Adam Drobot and Mike McNamara here as well, and they will be sharing the status updates. This is my first time presenting to the TAC. I have to admit I'm a little bit nervous, so hopefully everybody will be kind to me, given it's my first time. Yeah, it's probably the wrong thing to throw out there.
That's right. Exactly.
Now you're ready. All right, why don't we jump into the slides? Why don't we move right to the mission statement? Oh, that's right. Sorry.
You're in charge.
I'm in charge, yeah. So in March, Paul Steinberg presented the mission statement. I won't belabor the point here, just to bring out a few points. A key word that's shown up throughout this statement is collaboration, and that's something that we tried to keep focused within our working group as we move forward. We know that oftentimes security solutions are applied after the fact, and we realize an important goal of the working group is to look at ways of building security in up front, earlier in the product development cycle. As far as the mission statement key objectives, Again, I'm not going to read all these points. Paul discussed these in March. The main takeaways here, looking for us to enable the reduction of security patches that are being applied to products, looking for new processes and procedures during the development cycle, and bottom line, reducing security risks post-deployment. Those are the main things we take out of our key objectives. The working group members, as all of you know, Paul is the chair. Our vice chair, Ramani Pandurangan, unfortunately couldn't be here as well. Many thanks go out to our FCC liaisons, Jeff and Lauren. They've been very helpful in guiding us through our activities this year. And you can see our membership there as well, quite a rich set of people. All right, so let's move on to more of the meat of the presentation. So what is our progress since the March 10th meeting? We've been moving forward with the direction we've received from Jeff and Lauren. What we decided to do in March was to split our deliverables into two phases this year. And so we will have one set of deliverables that are targeted for the end of July, and then the working group will reconvene and decide what is the best use of our time for the second half of the year so that we hopefully have two sets of actionable deliverables, one in July and one in December. As far as the focus we have going into July, it's really two main areas. The first topic was going to be security metrics, and the working group has evolved away from this and moved more towards cybersecurity process and function. Now, the leader of that effort is Renato Delator. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here either, so what I'm going to do is provide a quick overview of where that particular sub-team is, and I'll get into more detail on that in the subsequent slides. The second topic, insider threats, that's being led by Harold Tietz and Mike McNamara, and so Mike will be providing a summary of the status of our work there. And then the third area, Adam Drobot has been looking more the forward-leaning initiative towards looking at where is the industry today, where are the industry trends around insider threat mitigation, and he found a lot of very interesting things there, and I'm sure you'll find his update very interesting. Again, the target is to have us report and provide actionable recommendations to the FCC in the end of July time frame. And Adam and I were just speaking before the meeting. We're realizing that's 6 weeks away. So we have a fair amount of work to do ahead of us by then.
But you have 4th of July break when you don't have any other obligations.
Yes, good point. Thank you. Okay, the first topic, the process and function progress. As I mentioned, Renato has been leading this effort. I'll also mention, giving up from Motorola Solutions, Paul and I pulled in Scott Shepard. Scott is our CISO, and so we felt that he has some valuable contributions to add here as well. And so we've injected that in. As far as the actual progress for this group, one of the guiding principles for us here is to think like the board. And what we really mean there is imagining that we're a board of directors of a company. What type of information, what type of process and functions would we want to see in place to make us feel confident that our organization, our entity, is doing the appropriate steps to take cybersecurity risk management seriously? If you look at some of the specific sub-bullets that we have listed on here, security risk management, vulnerability management, identity and access management, and security monitoring and response, those are the main focus areas that we see ourselves exploring and creating some form of a recommendation coming up here very quickly. The other aspect that we want to keep in mind as we think about this is, I think it's been brought up in the past as well, the NIST cybersecurity framework. We think that is a good document for us to reference. It provides industry standard, best practices of risk management, improving security and resiliency of critical infrastructure. It also defines several tiers of operation. It's a voluntary document. Actually, within Motorola itself, we've consumed the framework as an enterprise and actually assessed ourselves against that document, and we found it to be quite useful, and we've got some takeaways from that we're pursuing. So I mentioned it here in this context that is a document that we do want to keep in mind as we're moving through this topic, and again, not to overlap other activities or initiatives that are also pursuing the framework. It's really an endorsement of the framework here. We feel it's a good document, and we found it to be very useful.
If I could comment then on the process and function framing of the work, I think it is important not to duplicate effort that we're looking to the CSRIC to perform. So the CSRIC is looking at the cybersecurity framework and specifically outlining how it would communicate at a functional level to the board. I think what would make it unique from the work that you and the TAC are performing would be where can technology assist that communication to the board. Are there better ways to visualize risk if in fact we can express it to a board contextually? That would make what the TAC provides a unique contribution and not a competing recommendation to the Commission.
Okay. Thank you very much, Admiral. We'll definitely keep that in mind. We were aware of the work that CSRIC is doing, and so we've been cognizant of not trying to duplicate the effort there, but we'll definitely keep that in mind too. And again, our focus being technology. I think at this point we'll go ahead and transition. Mike McNamara is going to be providing us a summary of where the insider threat work has been to this point. Mike?
Thanks, George. As George mentioned, Harold Tietz is the lead on this sub-team. Harold was selected as he is the CIO, CTO of Service Provider Network, and really has firsthand information of developing means to reduce the insider threat. So one of the first things that we solicited amongst the sub-team was a best practice documentation or a playbook for that instant response process, way to execute and mitigate against the insider threat. So one of the first things was defining the insider threat, who or what it is. We define that as disgruntled, former, compromised, coerced employees, paid informants, business associates, consultants, contractors, definitely the supply chain, and this was even more evident as we get into the second slide. So I'll come back to the supply chain, as well as the growing phenomenon that we're all experiencing with bring your own device. Many employees unwittingly carry these devices into our companies, our corporations each day. Many of them that have been compromised, spyware, malware, and our security offices are having quite the challenge keeping up with deterring the type of, we'll just say, bad information that comes in on these devices. So that is definitely a growing one that the insider threat sub-team wants to focus on. Second, identifying insider motivation and removing this. And motivation we found in a couple different areas was defined as, as your company or corporation develops a insider threat program, be very upfront with the employees about what it is you're doing. Don't try to hide it. Don't try to disguise it. but be upfront that you're watching pretty much everything they do, not necessarily in a Big Brother sense, but you're watching what the employees are doing to protect the interests of the company. And just as George said, this playbook was also modeled after the cybersecurity framework, in breaking down the actions that need to take place in identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and then also recovering from when a threat exists and mitigation takes place. So, Admiral, definitely heard what you said about not overlapping with CISRIC. Just as we did, as I said, the playbook was just modeled after the framework, but then defining each of the threats beyond or in much greater detail. George, if you could go to the second slide. We did have the opportunity, we're trying to line up a couple of industry experts to discuss their view on the insider threat, and thus far we've been able to line up two, and one of those discussions took place last Friday at the sub-team level. Experts from industry, and excellent presentation from a gentleman with Lockheed Martin, who has only been in industry 2 years, but spent 33 years with Air Force Office of Special Investigations, so has a much deeper background with the government. And one of the first things that he pointed out was, the focus of foreign countries has shifted away from really trying to steal trade secrets, steal government information away from the U.S. government, and has shifted more towards the penetration of corporate America, because they find that a much richer target, ways to violate us, violate corporations, violate the United States, as well as take down corporations in the form of industrial espionage. In fact, Doug Thomas from Lockheed Martin said, social media is one of the greatest gifts to hackers in foreign countries, because there is so much information out there that people are, once again, unwittingly posting about their companies, such things as Facebook, LinkedIn, and many of those other social sites, that so much information about the company that is ultimately detrimental to the corporation itself. Another thing that was pointed out in this discussion was, you're not only, when you're developing an insider threat framework, you're not only responsible for your corporation itself, but also the supply chain coming into the corporation. So your program is only as good as how well you can protect everyone in your supply chain, because if one of those companies is penetrated, ultimately you'll also be penetrated too. Lockheed has developed their own internal tool comprised of what they call PRIs, potential risk indicators. And this was a very rich set of metrics, approximately 26 different metrics with anywhere between 3 and 5 different subgroups within each metrics, that defines at the employee level, not at the group level, but once again at the employee level, various indicators to watch for, such as origin of birth, travel to a foreign country, age, a wide variety of things that this system is looking for behaviorally about the employee. A couple examples that stuck out were, there may be a person who has been employed by the corporation for 30 or 35 years and is coming upon retirement, and that person's risk indicator is very low because they just really want to retire and kind of fade out into the sunset, whereas a 25 to 30-year-old upstart employee with a great deal of debt, trying to make a name for his or herself, and potentially finding out that they're about to go through a reduction in force and be affected. Obviously, that employee would receive a much higher indicator to be looked after. And once again, as I spoke on the last slide, these are some of the motivations that proactively communicating the program that your company has developed is one of the things that takes away that motivation from the employees to essentially create a threat. A couple of the things that we've captured that we want to address before the end of July timeframe is can the Commission help with information sharing across the industry during real-time events? Obviously, nobody likes to release that they had a security vulnerability, but if something happens in one corporation, how quickly is it to pick up in another or across the world? We certainly, as service providers in running communications networks and the larger internet, obviously want to exchange information about how do we stop threats or attacks before they start. And then one that we also identified at the end of 2013 in the cybersecurity framework that we did back then was how can smaller industries afford these tools, especially as we are outsourcing more things to the cloud. Smaller corporations aren't necessarily investing in large IT departments. They're outsourcing a lot of this functionality. How can they afford to protect themselves? So next steps, as George said, in the next 6 weeks is we do have one additional industry expert discussion lined up. Our purpose is to gather more information on best practices and especially technology benefits, which Adam will talk here in just a minute, and then formalize our recommendations in terms of a white paper or a presentation to the Commission by the end of July. Once again, focusing on tools and best practices available within the industry as well as information sharing. Adam, over to you.
So what I'm going to cover is a survey we have done of the state of insider threat mitigation, really focusing on technology. And I think it's interesting to sort of start off with a couple of observations, and I think we've heard similar things from some of the other working groups. I'd say, the first one is there is really a plethora of well-publicized incidents around insider threat. So obviously it's something we're thinking about deeply. But at the same time, you find the use of information and communication technology for all kinds of critical purposes, and we're becoming much more dependent on sort of the basic ICT technologies, and those in turn are moving at a very rapid pace, and as somebody put it, what it does for you is it really increases the attack surface. So all of a sudden, I'd say we're encountering new phenomena in what used to be a fairly staid and mature field of professionals who looked after things like insider threat. Okay, and when you look at it, the explosion of the kinds of attacks is, when you start digging at it, really sort of staggering in some sense. And, it depends on the proliferation of apps, open source, outsourcing, movement to the cloud, network function virtualization, I would say all kinds of practices that we're taking on in the way we run our enterprises. And in the middle of this, you find a lot of technologies that are, again, getting some degree of publicity, I would say many of which have not been vetted at this point. So if I were to take a look at, what some of those key technology areas are, I think as Nomi, previously said, user authentication, very high on the list, okay? And it's not just, who is the user, it's who's the user, where are they, what are they authorized for, what are they not. There's quite a bit of complexity around that. Anything from the use of biometrics, fusion techniques, different compound methods of trying to establish identity, looking at people's patterns, really an awful lot of stuff in there. The second area is information protection, because the value of what people are after is really information. Okay? And the question is, are there better technologies, better methods that can be applied in the first place to protect what you have? Next is the area sort of analytics. Tremendous amount of work on anomaly detection. Is something out of pattern, out of kilter? Can I find a needle in a haystack because I have a technique that makes the needle very visible all of a sudden? A lot of stuff on physical access protection, because access to facilities, access to the means of communication, remote access to computing devices. There's a lot of things that also are happening with the physical plant. The use of video all over the place, and the analytics around that. So I think that makes a lot of difference. And next area would be resource access management, creation of whitelists. I can only run this application on this particular device. Analysis on connection. If you stick a thumb drive into a device, nothing goes over unless it's been carefully looked at. So a lot of technologies in those areas. So in sort of taking a look at what's on the scene, what's going on in there, I'd say I took the first look was taking a look at federal organizations, and the big gorilla in this game of insider threat happens to be the U.S. CERT. If you have trouble falling asleep at night, there is a 350-page book on this. I think the latest edition just came out. But they're responsible for incident response, a lot of analysis at this point. And if you look at other agencies, ODNI looks after the Intel community, obviously a tremendous amount going on there. DHS, and then NIST has actually been designated as the place that's actually doing the cybersecurity framework, things along those lines. When you look at research activities, all the major agencies that fund either early or applied science are in this game. There's quite a bit of coordination through NITR-D, which is a White House agency. And again, tremendous amount of work going on in sort of cybersecurity. If I were to look at other organizations that are either in the standards work or doing background research on this, identified over 20 different organizations just in the U.S., over 20 major federal academic centers, all focusing on the insider threat space and all looking at advanced technology. If you take a look at the VC community, found over 30 startups in that space, mostly looking at analytics. We have the solution to this problem. We can collect stuff and analyze it for you. And fairly serious organizations, Splunk, Palantir, things of that sort, essentially. If we were to take a look at commercial offerings, all of the major consulting houses, whether it's Accenture, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, or Service Arms, every one of them has an offering in this. In fact, what I was surprised by is you look through all the majors, all the federal integrators, a lot of smaller companies. That list is hundreds of organizations at this point. So very, very crowded field. Doesn't mean that the problem has been knocked off. So what we're going to be doing in our work plan is re-examining the technical approaches to insider threat, and that means how do you catch it and prevent it, mitigation, what can you do better in terms of response, and what can you do better in terms of recovery. Oops, I didn't change the slide. Right.
We changed it for you.
Okay. There we go. Okay. And if I were to take a look at specific technology areas, I would say resilient architectures for cyber defense. So in other words, networks, information systems that degrade gracefully. A lot of investment we see in trusted computing. So if somebody gets in, the damage that they can cause is fairly minimal. Access control, big data and analytics, social network analysis, a lot of stuff on formal methods. And by the way, we'd like input from the TAC members if they have any specific areas we ought to be looking at. I'm happy to hear from them. I think we're going to be looking at the implication and challenges specifically for critical infrastructure. And then we plan to engage with academic, commercial, and government experts and run a series of workshops in the outquarters. Okay. Thank you.
So if I could comment on the insider threat piece, or did you have another element for insider threats? Yeah. This isn't new, right? We have had insiders as threats for as long as we've been a nation. Benedict Arnold was one of our first insiders that became a threat. And if you're watching the Turn series, you see that threats can go back and forth, right? I'm glad you laid out the predispositions for what becomes an insider threat, because it really is varied. I would add one to the list that you've had, and that's ideology. We have found some that rationalize their actions based on an ideology towards, just if everything were public, we'd be a better nation. We'd be a better company. So there's that piece in there as well. As you look at how technology can assist combating the insider threat, I would encourage you to consider that some of the real challenges is in this space. The potential risk indicator is a very good best practice that you outlined from one company. But at the heart of the challenge, you've got two competing sides of this, right? You know that you want to identify those predispositions, link those next to precursor activity that an insider would have, right? They're going to case the joint. They don't want to be caught while they're working to gather all of the information they would need to consummate whatever effect that they have. But that comes right into conflict, if you're the guy looking for insiders, with privacy and the rights of employees, which have to be the centerpiece of any program, because those have to be protected. If we go to the point where the search for an insider starts to infringe on legitimate privacy expectations, then what is it we're defending? So technology, I believe, can help work to protect privacy, to protect rights of employees throughout that identification of predispositions and precursor activities. And when we had looked at this before in another environment, we really looked at some models out there like credit in the credit card companies, right? You got a pretty good idea what goes into your credit score. At some point, it becomes a privacy issue if all the things that dinged your credit score become public to everyone. But at the end of the day, you still have a number, which is your credit score, and people know how to work towards lowering that. I'd encourage you to look at applying something like that to employee pedigrees. I'd also suggest that this is a team sport, right? Because many of your employees are going to be her employees 3 years from now, are going to be his employees 3 years from now. And do we start over in the IT cyber field in creating that pedigree every time an employee walks in the door the first time? Right now, I would suggest that there's a lot of starting over. And there's only so much that you can share from what an employee did for you with what an employee will do starting out in another company. So you might want to look at how other professions have approached this. In the legal profession, in the FCC, I work with a lot of lawyers now. It's a profession.
You've noticed that.
That's right. And their reputation is not just with the company they work for, it is a reputation before the bar. And the bar regularly evaluates not just the credentials of members of the bar, but also things they've been involved in, their pedigree, if you will. We might want to look, you all might want to look at, in the telco sector, raising the threshold of what constitutes a profession, professionals, in touching the most critical parts of your infrastructure. That would be a way for you then to ensure that as you're hiring that new employee, there's not just a, hey, I see the certificates that they have, but you can match that towards, well, how many actual areas that they've touched where they've had to demonstrate trustworthiness, where there's been temptations associated that they might have gone wrong. So if you can link that to your predispositions and create a professional series, and you could even go one further, not just professions that are managed by associations, but it may be that there's certain actions that are just so critical for the intellectual property that you want to keep safe, that you actually want to go to a licensing paradigm and actually have the FCC or others help in that licensing paradigm for the things that are, when I think of top-level domain servers, maybe in the future you ought to have a license before you're given something that could impact nationwide communications with change of one line of code. So the other area, and related to that, is in your companies, think about how an insider can have the most damaging effect. If you've got global authorities for a single administrator, you kind of have one person who can take it all down. I didn't see anything in what you listed that goes to what I found to be the most effective defense against insiders, and that's built-in segmentation of
that's compartmentalization.
Well, maybe that was it, yeah. Where you've got an A side, B side piece, and one person can't do something. There's DOD in their response to, in the IC and fuss and stood, they went automatically to two-person rule. Many of the companies that you talked about can't afford to go to two-person rule, but you can divide up functions so that in order to consummate an action, one person can't do it. There's got to be one person, and a second person has to bring the other side of the key.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think, if you describe the way somebody can treat an employee, one of the most difficult areas, in fact, is this overall change in practice. And that is, companies have 1099s, they have contractors, they have outsourcing. There are many, many people who now touch the plant that traditionally used not to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
I'm very encouraged that you said supply chain.
And
so supply chain could be code as well.
Exactly.
And NIST work in supply chain is very fresh, and if you think about applying that, not just to hardware, but also to code and firmware
software,
as well.
codeware, access, servicing, all of those issues.
Right. And so how can you communicate across that supply chain about the people that touch the software, the hardware,
and maintain privacy at the same time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, our time is running. Any comments from the TAC you'd like to make? Nomi, go ahead.
Sure, just one. Just back on slide, I guess, 9, under issues to address, it asks the question, can the FCC help with information sharing across the industry during real-time events? I guess I just wanted to hear your insights about liability protection for that information sharing. I was wondering if there would be kind of coverage for that, or I just wanted to hear your insights about that.
Well, that's a great question. Broadly, blanket liability protection runs counter to trying to generate a market accountability for doing the right things, right? So I'm not sure that blanket liability protection would be constructive in this space, but liability protections vis-a-vis what constitutes privacy, rights of employees piece, maybe something more narrow that would allow a company to do what they think is the right thing, where before they would have held back because they really didn't have an ability to protect against that employee that said, oh, that wasn't the right thing. We'd love to hear from the TAC if you want to go down that path, that absent blanket liability protection, are there nuggets that you feel that would be useful that would still support market accountability for doing the right thing while encouraging the report of the whiffs of smoke that need to be collected to be able to say, oh, yeah, there's a fire and that's where it is?
Great. This is a general question to the group. We talked extensively in our IoT group about security, privacy for machine objects that consumers use at home. And so, two-part question, I guess. Did you look into the whole world of IoT and how to protect consumer data in otherwise very obscure companies that provide these services, aka garage openers, locks, what have you? And B, how do you protect that information to go inadvertently to all the wrong places?
I'll just make a quick comment on that. I don't think we focused too much on IoT yet. We've certainly discussed it. That's something that we want to look at. We also have been discussing the opportunities to collaborate with the IoT working group. So that's certainly something that we want to pursue.
I'll just say from experience, I served on the ITS board for DOT, so looking at telematics and the same issue, okay? And what really comes up as probably one of the most difficult issues in this is the desire for security countered for the strong desire for privacy. Okay? And that desire for privacy wants you to be able to access everything, have end-to-end insight, which is why I don't like proxies, by the way. Okay. On the other hand, it also sort of causes real problems with privacy. Okay? And I would say there have been lots of approaches to it. From what I see, no real hard answer to that question at this point.
Okay. One of the things that I would offer on that the Internet of Things, if you look at the bright side premise, is so much from what you could do from the big data analysis of how the things are used and what they're seeing, and that. But on the other side, protecting privacy, it would be very useful at the technology level to commit to how can we anonymize the elements associated with a thing in the Internet of Things as early as possible in the architecture, so that you can still enjoy the best advantages of the big data analysis of those things with as early as possible protecting the essential elements of privacy.
John?
quickly, I was looking at the topics that you have here, and they're all obviously, all of them are really important. The one that just stuck out to me, and I would encourage your team to continue to focus on, is DDoS. With our customer set, we are by all means trying to help them with those attacks. We're doing some work that we'd be happy to share with your committee as well. So just some encouragement to focus on that one particular area, not that the others aren't as important.
Great. Rush, you're the last
Okay. Just curious on the IoT piece. We'd be very happy to work with you guys, and we plan to reach out, so let's set a formal date in the next couple of weeks. The other thing on your security threats, have you considered putting things in big buckets? Because I look at it as you have the DDoS attacks, and then you have people trying to steal information, which are different. And there's clearly differences in those sort of signatures or fingerprints of those type of attacks. So I'm just kind of curious if you've tried to separate that out. And applying it back to IoT, a comment just made by the Admiral was, trying to leverage the big data. I think that's critical with IoT. One of the challenges is the real-time requirement of how do you mitigate that as close to the edge, or as you said, deep into the architecture, or close out to the edge of the architecture as possible. And that's where I think, we don't want to reinvent the work you're potentially doing on cybersecurity. You're the security group. We'd like to liaise with you folks on some of the IoT security specifics we have.
Now, Russ, there's probably one area which, I didn't explicitly address, and that is you have security of privacy. The other thing is people want to get a job done. And usually they break rules, they break procedures to do that. Okay? How do you actually create systems, where people will follow the security regime so you can actually enforce it? Okay? And for IoT, that may actually be a fairly important issue.
We're actually going to have to break, David, to give Nomi proper time. We're beginning to cut short our cleanup hitter already. Just final item, make sure that as you put all your focus in place, actionable recommendations, that's the key. I'm sure the Admiral is looking for those as well.
So one last point.
One last.
To get to the last couple of slides, I would only ask for the working group to take a look at the final slides. We're looking for feedback on our list of topics for the second half of the year. We'd very much like to hear from folks on how to prioritize that list. Thank you.
Okay, good. Nomi, you're on.
Okay, thanks. I don't have the clicker, but you can advance the slides for me, whoever has it. You can just advance it for me. That's okay. I'm okay with that. I definitely can't catch it, even though I'm the cleanup hitter. So maybe just back one slide. Just first to my great working team members. We've had a really terrific group of people who've been very active participants. We've had calls that folks like Kevin Kahn have joined early from the West Coast regularly, and I'm really appreciative. I also want to just thank two people not on the slide, which is Kitty O'Hara and Marva Johnson, who are regulatory specialists helping from both Bright House and Verizon, who've been terrific. And then we actually are also fortunate to have 4 FCC members helping us, Walter Johnston, Henning, Kalpak Gide, and Billy Layton, who are over there. So thank you. We've had really great input, so thank you. And then on to the next slide. Today's discussion, we're going to touch base on our original mission. We're going to share an update on our work effort to date. We're going to share a reference architecture plan that we have, and we'd love to receive feedback from all of you. One other thing is that we also, because this working group has kind of been in existence for many years, we also spent some time at the beginning just sorting through what's been learned previously so we don't duplicate efforts since we have a lot of new people. So we've between the last TAC meeting and this TAC meeting, I would say, bridging into the next slide, we spent some time reviewing our mission, which was a very complex mission. and we spent some time reviewing what's previously been done. And then I think, like any work group, I think the most important and most difficult part of our work together has been figuring out what would be actionable and what would be productive. And I think we've come across it over the last couple of discussions. So I feel like we're actually coming to a really good place, which I'm excited to share with you today. So again, our mission had really these 6 objectives, and we've had discussions with the FCC about how important is it that we treat this as kind of an exam and that we try to handle all 6, or is this more of a buffet and we be productive where we can and help where we can? And the instructions we've received back is this is more like a buffet where we could be productive, pick and choose, what's interesting. So you'll kind of see what we've picked from that. So, okay. So next slide. So Lynn Merrill, who's over there, Kevin Kahn, and Steve Lanning have done some really terrific work completing some surveys with 3 rural operators, and we plan to do some more. And these next few slides are some headlines from those surveys. They've been really helpful and surprising. I think you'll also find some of these results surprising too. So the companies we interviewed were Hamilton, which is in Nebraska, Panhandle, which is in the south, and Silver Star, which had rocky and mountainous terrain. That was one of the objectives that we wanted to learn from companies that had more difficult terrain. These companies generally all report construction costs in the range of $15,000 and $85,000 per mile. And some of the common themes we found, because these are all smaller operators, is that generally the operator is very in tune with the company, and that if the community failed, so did the company. So the companies are just very in tune with helping their community be successful. The employees typically live in the communities, and they see and hear from the customers, so they're very employee-focused companies. And we found that generally one of the themes that you'll see in the next slides is that once the middle mile solutions are solved, the companies felt like there were sufficient technologies to help them solve the last mile solution. So one of the more difficult solutions was typically the middle mile, and once it was solved, it was like the floodgates opened, and now they could really solve the last mile problems. We also found that these companies, and I think this may be a trend for operators going forward, I don't know for sure, that's probably my own commentary there, is that these companies aggressively adopted hybrid solutions. They were not really single-focused on any one technology. And I think that's very interesting, is that companies like this, when faced with very difficult challenges to solve, they embraced varying and diverse technologies to solve the problems. So on to the next slide. These are findings that have to do with the last mile access again. So these companies innovate by embracing these diverse technologies. All of these companies all started really as telephone companies, so they started with DSL. 2 of them added hybrid fiber coax solutions later. And the majority of these companies are now doing more fiber to the home when they do new build. The majority of their networks are today fiber to the node being the transition point to either copper or coax technologies. These operators have felt very content and very happy with solutions to extend copper life by reaching customers using VDSL. They've had creative deployment of wireless solutions, both WiMAX and LTE. And they have found some areas unreachable with terrestrial wireless solutions due to terrain. And some distances have been too far and required multiple repeaters to reach down to canyons. So next slide is construction methods. So generally they've used existing facilities as long as they could. As the ROIs were there, they moved to newer technologies. They generally have the survey requirements for construction along state and highways vary greatly by state, and they generally plan new builds with other utilities to share costs. They do things like placing conduit with water and gas. And generally, because these employees are so involved and close to their communities, they generally are very aware of local opportunities to make new build easier. They're aware of construction opportunities and opportunities to curtail costs. So I think we found good findings there. The next slide is about broadband speeds. They generally serve their towns with broadband speeds above 10 megabits per second in the downstream. And we really found that throughout. There was just maybe in some of the high construction areas, there were some areas where they served remaining customers with ADSL or wireless with a lower speed. And that was only in a few of the higher construction areas. But otherwise, they were able to serve as many customers as possible with a minimum of 10 meg. And then on voice services, these companies have varying stages of VoIP in their network, but it's not generally complete throughout their infrastructure. We saw that access to a soft switch seemed to be the key turning point for fully deploying voice. For them, that transition point had not yet arrived. Now, interestingly, some of these companies did have access to a soft switch. In fact, at least one of the companies wholesales soft switch services to other rural operators, but hadn't yet found that the timing was right to embrace the transition for their own company. So that was very interesting. I would say that's it for soft switches and voice. On the middle mile, which I think is one of the most interesting points, is that many of these companies, and I know I see this in the cable industry as well, have either installed larger fiber networks on their own, or they've joined or formed some kind of consortium to form statewide networks to reduce costs. And again, I definitely see this in the cable industry as well, innovative partnering between some of the smaller operators to find access all the way through to larger connection points. These companies have also invested in redundancy nicely. We found good examples of that throughout the survey, which I think is an important point to look for more rural areas. Due to the longer distances to internet gateways, the companies work to bring traffic closer to the endpoint of their own network to reduce costs and therefore prices. They've adopted regional interconnect solutions where they offer regional hosting and transit to mitigate high middle mile costs. So I think those were all very innovative solutions. So those were so we briefly kind of touched on our mission and the work of the previous working groups, and then these really innovative findings from rural operators that I think are great for us to watch. So then we started talking as a group about how we really want to be useful to the FCC towards those 6 points given to us. And I know Dale Hatfield isn't here today, and I wish he were, but he actually shared this really productive suggestion with us, that's what you're going to see in the next slides about this reference architecture plan. He suggested that this was really probably the best way for us to serve as like headlights for the commission of what's coming around the corner. Was he suggested that we take these learnings of what we're learning from the rural operators and other operators and technology vendors to try to put together a reference architecture of what's happening in both the access network and what's happening on the backhaul and interconnect network. What are some of the changes coming, and that perhaps if we were to do this, that we could serve as a technical context to the FCC of how these technologies are evolving and how they'll offer new solutions to customers. So that's, and I'm eager to hear some feedback from others in this discussion in this part of the meeting. Let's see. We also we broke this up into two pieces where we have Marvin leading the access piece and Tom McGarry leading the backbone piece of our reference architecture work that we're doing. You know what? I might borrow that water there. Thanks a lot, David. Sorry about that. Sorry. So we're excited about this. We've started to have very robust discussion about this. Hoping that this reference architecture could include the possibility that the user's ISP. We think that this reference architecture can show how all of the communications, including video services, are evolving. Next slide. This next slide is our very first start, and we actually even have taken it a little bit further already at what the architecture could look like. As you can see, we kind of divide the ISP network into 6 components, starting with the access network on the left, and then the metro broadband network, the core network, the managed IP network, the communications complex, and the video complex. Again, we think that this can provide a high-level view of how the ISP network provides broadband and other services to users. This reference architecture plan will include connections to other networks. You can kind of see them both up above and off to the right. You'll see the connection to the internet via the core network, and then our connection we reflect connection to legacy TDM networks, to 911 services and other IP managed services via the managed IP network. So we think that this reference architecture can really help provide detail on all of these components, and that's the next step that we hope to do, is to drill down into that and to show how all elements are evolving and how the services are evolving along with the architecture. So next steps are between now and September, to have working sessions to create a draft of this high-level architecture for review at our September meeting, and then we hope to refine and publish it for the December meeting. We also hope to continue these surveys with access vendors, including some cable providers as well, and some service providers of larger sizes, as well as, I think that's it. And then we also hope to continue to follow the trials that the Commission has encouraged. We think those also will serve as helpful input to us as well. And then last, we also still are doing some work on the corner cases. Whenever we have discussions as a group, we very quickly start to land our discussion in talking about how some of the really difficult corner cases of the IP transition will be solved. John Barnhill's actually been doing some great work for us to kind of help us to aggregate those and look at those together as much as possible instead of each one individually. So we also hope to do some work in that area as well. Thanks.
Great. Another important area is
First, great approach regarding your surveys. I think you should continue doing that. But I'm wondering, from the feedback you received from some of these rural carriers, if they had any impending challenges, either related to speed, reach, or pricing. Did you get any feedback related to those dimensions at all?
Invite Steve and Kevin and Lynn to respond, but I would say in general, we heard that they felt confident they were able to solve the challenges to meet the needs of their community. So the competitive landscape wasn't the same in a community like that as in some larger markets too. So that could be affecting their view.
I think my reaction to the surveys we did was, and I suspect this reflects Steve and Lynn as well, was just how aggressive these guys are relative to carriers at large. I mean, I was expecting, kind of the classic myth of the backwater, God knows what you've got, and these guys, they knew what they were doing, they understood the technology, they, were figuring out solutions that worked for them, whether it was how to bore through solid rock or, how to trench along a gravel road, and it was, we're moving at the pace that it seems we need to move, and we're delivering the services, and we're going to get rid of the remaining TDM as it makes sense to do so. So I was actually mostly surprised with just how how on the ball they were, because I think I had that sort of very naive, mythical view that somehow these guys that were kind of operating the backcountry were, somehow not on top of things.
Yeah, no, that was exactly where I was going with my question. So as far as transition to IP, and, we've
I
all...
know better about them than I have about some of the other parts of the transition.
Which is a terrific find. Really is very valuable.
I think Lynn and Steve had a similar reaction.
Mm-hmm. I think that, I would just add to Kevin's comment, which I loved, is from what I heard from the surveys is that these companies are selfishly protective of their communities. They want the very best for their communities, and they're willing to embrace any technology or any way to get it done. Right? Would you say they're very crafty?
The only thing I'd like to add to that, when you were asking a little bit about some of the things I may run into, is when we go ahead and we talk to one or two of them, the problems they ran into dealt with, the cost of getting out to individual customers or to particular customers, and where they ran into some of those costs dealt with if they were going down a highway in one state versus a highway in another state. In one state, they would have to go ahead and do a survey, have someone hired to do a surveyor do a survey down the right-of-way before they started. Once they plowed the cable in or put the cable in, they'd have to turn around and do a survey afterwards, which really was exorbitant as far as on their cost. They go and they're, 2 miles over there in a different state, and the guy says, just 4 feet within the fence line, you're good. So there are certain things as far as there. The other thing was, from the environmental aspect, for some of these companies, depending on if they were around forest property or other areas, they would have to go ahead and spend like $50,000 to do some sort of survey. And it didn't matter if the survey was for something that was 5 miles long or if it was for 100 miles long. Their cost started at roughly about $50,000, and it didn't incremental up as far as that much as far as when they added the extra miles. So when they would go through and they would try to do 10 customers, it would be a lot larger cost than what it would be do if they had some huge project that they were doing. So,
Kevin?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a conversation actually that Lynn and I had before the meeting, and that is, and I noticed I hadn't seen you reference architecture before, but you have all the communication stuff on kind of the head end of the whole architecture, and just a suggestion as you refine the architecture to look, with virtualization, there's an opportunity to put very small scale voice switching, IMS infrastructure, other things like that, placed farther out in the network, and that would further help reduce the middle mile costs, which seem to be a key one. So it's something to look at, because you could do things on much smaller scale now than you could just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. That's a great addition. Thank you. I like that a lot. And I would agree. I would also just add, there's also probably same thing about the interconnect. Just that I don't think it properly reflects the complexity of the interconnect, that there's not a single way to get into the access networks. That same thing. That's a great note. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, we're just going to make our way around the table. So, Greg?
One thing that would interest me is to know more about their motivation for making a lot of these changes. Did you find out if there were any regulatory requirements for them to do what they're doing, or do they have competition?
No, I would probably say it was mostly about serving the needs of their customers. And while they have some regulatory requirements, one thing that we did note about these surveys was that some of these operators cross the borders of their regulatory areas, and then as they cross those borders, then they only offered broadband services. So I would note that was kind of a very interesting finding. But I would love if Lynn and Kevin and Steve add to that. But it was my impression that these companies are just very. Well, I think they have some competition, but mostly they're very motivated to serve their communities.
I'll just say real quickly that it was mainly that since they've grown up, lived, everybody lives in the communities. Their wife gets their hair done down at the beauty shop. If they don't have the speeds, they don't have the services to go ahead and offer, then it becomes something more of not just from a business standpoint, but also your personal standpoint. When you go to the ball games, you do things. You are that communication company in that area, and they look to you. So they're out there trying to do the best they can for them. As far as that's what I got from this, and everybody else.
We also heard that they were taking pride in attracting developers and people working in the internet space to their communities, that their pricing was actually very good, their service quality was excellent, and that they felt like they were actually pulling people in and building their community and adding value to their community, and those guys were making lots of money, which they then spent in town.
Yeah, Naomi, and the middle mile and the or backhaul. That's one of the things, at least in Virginia and West Virginia, that the broadband providers have seen as an issue. And as you said, once the middle mile costs or the broadband costs, the backhaul costs went down, then all of a sudden technology got implemented and things got done. One of the biggest problems that we see that might be an actionable item is that if you wish to be a broadband-only provider, or you wish to build, in Virginia we had a very successful model. We did what was called the MBC. And with the MBC, we needed to find a way to get from Ashburn, Virginia into central Virginia, where most of the jobs had disappeared when the furniture factories had gone overseas, and we had a lot of power that was coming in from West Virginia. So we realized that we could extend the data center operations into Southern Virginia. But the problem was the backhaul costs were too high, and there was just nothing available. So what was formed was the MBC, which was a broadband-only cooperative, which just built middle mile service. Did not sell transport. Only sold transport. It didn't sell internet service. It didn't compete with the carriers or anything else through. And in doing so, once this was put in place, we had some cities we had one city in Danville, which was the 5th largest city in Virginia, which had dropped down to almost 30,000 people, which made a complete recovery from that, coming back through moving the technology. And Virginia saw more infrastructure investment coming in from companies like Microsoft and others than we saw in a 400-year history of the state was putting through. These are great examples of why middle mile was so important. But the problem that we have when we try to replicate that in other states or locations is that if we're a broadband-only company and we want to build fiber from X to X, we're not recognized by the FCC as a certified telecommunications provider, so we can't get the easements and right-of-ways. And we have to battle our way through every single attachment and every single thing that is done. Now, if there was some way that the FCC could find a way that a broadband transport provider, which could be somehow given some type of a ability to be recognized, or the FCC could say, that requirement as being a certified telecommunications provider for a broadband transport requirement is not required, since it's not providing telecommunications services, but yet is a facilitator of such. If we could do that, that would be a massive action that could rapidly expand broadband-only transport in the U.S.
Well, I think this is a key one for the working group to really dig into. And we've approached the magic hour, and there are a couple tent cards, but make that very, very quick if you could. Julie has a meeting with the chairman, and he needs to go. So we all need to go, I suppose. So Marvin, quick.
Well, following up on that last comment, I read recently that Verizon has been claiming that when they install fiber for FiOS, it's a Title II deployment, and therefore they get access to right-of-way, but then when they operate it as an internet service, and they're unregulated. So it seems to me we ought to be able to do the same thing for the middle mile.
I agree. Okay, good comment. Jesse.
No, just 2 points, Dennis. I think the issue that I think would be worthwhile looking at is this intersection between rural and underserved or impoverished communities that have a similar need. That's the first point. The second one would be, was there any look in terms of this movement in the architecture towards embracing 4G LTE sort of IP capabilities to go with that?
We're just starting the architecture work, so I would think that it will include that. It's our hope that it would include all access technologies, including 4G and LTE, even satellite, everything.
Great. Walter.
Very quickly, you mentioned return on investment. How would you compare return on investment in terms of capital recovery intervals and just the percent return on investment to a company in a much more competitive area? Are they deferring return on capital? Are they accepting lower return on investments, or is it comparable?
I don't think we asked that. It's a good question, right? I don't think we asked that specifically. Did we, Steve or Kevin or Lynn? No. I don't believe we did. It is a good, interesting question, though. Okay, we'll do a follow-up on that.
Okay, we have passed the magic hour, so I do want to just close with a thank you, first of all, to the FCC team. You've been noted in the working groups, but I'd like to recognize once again all of the members of the FCC team that facilitate and make this all work. So really appreciate that. Appreciate, in his absence, Admiral Simpson coming and spending his time with us. Special thanks to the working group chairs and to the speakers and clearly to the full TAC members. Julie gets next to the final word.
Great presentations today. Keep up the work. It sounds like we still have a lot to do, and I just want to assure you that the chairman and I know the other commissioners have been following the work of the TAC, and so what you're doing really does make a difference.
Walter?
I appreciate the high level of attendance we keep enjoying at this TAC, and dedications. I've attended my work group. I've also oversaw Nomi's work group and stuck my head in a few of the others. I know there's a lot of time and effort being put into this. The FCC really thanks you for the contributions you've made, both in your time and the recommendations. And we have a chairman who understands the value of the tax. So I think this is a very opportune time to make suggestions.
And with that, remember, actionable recommendations. We need them. The 19th of June, smart device theft. Thank you to those that signed up for the Form 477 team, and it looked like almost everyone who raised your hand did sign up, so appreciate that. Final item, the next TAC meeting, the 23rd of September. Thank you, one and all. Safe travels. Have a good summer.